Plaso was not built as a place of detention. It was built as a place of domination. On the outskirts of Krakow, over the ruins of two Jewish cemeteries, the Nazis created Plaso concentration camp, a camp without gas chambers at first, without walls of secrecy, and without the illusion of order. What defined Plaso was not machinery, but terror itself. Here, violence was visible, arbitrary, personal. Prisoners lived under constant fear, not of transport lists or distant extermination sites, but of sudden death delivered by guards who ruled through chaos. Beatings, executions, and humiliation were part of daily routine. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on chance, silence, and obedience. Plaso became a camp where cruelty was improvised, where power meant the ability to kill without reason, and where thousands were worked, starved, and murdered in full view of the city nearby. Smoke did not rise from chimneys, screams carried instead. This documentary traces the complete history of Plaso. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Birth of Terror in Krakow. Plaso did not emerge suddenly as a concentration camp. It was born out of a city already being dismantled piece by piece. To understand how Plaso came into existence, we must return to Krakow in the early years of Nazi occupation, when persecution unfolded not in secrecy, but in full view of streets, homes, and workplaces. After the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, Krakow was transformed from a historic cultural center into the capital of the so-called general government. German banners hung from buildings. Jewish businesses were marked, seized, or closed. Laws multiplied daily, each one narrowing the space in which Jewish life could exist. Identification badges, forced labor assignments, curfews, confiscations, none of these were temporary. They were steps in a deliberate process that aimed not only to control but to dehumanize. By 1941, Jewish residents were forced into the Krakow ghetto, sealed behind walls and guarded streets. Families were compressed into overcrowded apartments. Hunger became constant. Disease spread. Deportations began to thin the population. What remained was a community living under permanent uncertainty, aware that survival depended on forces entirely beyond their control. As the ghetto was liquidated in 1942 and 1943, the Nazis faced a logistical question: what to do with the remaining labor force they still considered useful? The answer was Plaso. Construction began on the site of two destroyed Jewish cemeteries, a deliberate act of desecration that set the tone for everything that followed. Gravestones were smashed and reused as building material. Human remains were scattered into the soil. The ground itself was turned into an instrument of humiliation. Unlike earlier camps that evolved slowly, Plaso concentration camp was designed from the beginning as a place where violence would not be hidden. Prisoners were brought in from the ghetto under armed guard, forced to build their own barracks, fences, and roads. There was no illusion of order or discipline. Guards ruled through unpredictability. Rules shifted without warning. Punishment was arbitrary. Survival depended not on compliance alone, but on luck. From its earliest days, Plaso functioned as a forced labor camp intertwined with terror. Prisoners were assigned to quarry work, construction, and later to nearby factories producing for the German war economy. Exhaustion was built into the system. Rations were deliberately insufficient. Workdays stretched from before dawn until nightfall. Beatings were routine. Executions occurred in open spaces, meant to be seen. The camp was positioned so that its presence could not be ignored. Visible from the surrounding hills, audible from nearby neighborhoods. Plaso did not rely on secrecy. Fear itself was the mechanism of control. At the center of this system stood Amon Göth, whose command turned Plaso into a place synonymous with sadistic violence. Göth did not administer terror from a distance. He participated in it personally. From his villa overlooking the camp, he shot prisoners at random. A stumble, a pause, a glance. Any moment could become a death sentence. His actions were not aberrations. They were tolerated, encouraged, and rewarded. Under his authority, cruelty became routine, and murder became administrative. Plaso demonstrated that genocide did not require gas chambers to function. It could be carried out through domination, forced labor, starvation, and the constant threat of instant death. As transports arrived and the camp expanded, Plaso became a central node in the Nazi camp network of southern Poland. Prisoners passed through on their way to other camps, particularly Auschwitz. Some remained to be worked to death. Others were executed when they could no longer meet labor demands. Families were separated permanently. Children were murdered alongside adults. Medical care was non-existent except as a tool of experimentation or neglect. Disease spread unchecked. The dead were burned in mass graves nearby. Their remains later exhumed and destroyed in an attempt to erase evidence as the war turned against Germany. By the time Plaso reached its full operation, it stood as a clear example of how Nazi policy evolved from segregation to annihilation. It was a camp built not on industrial efficiency, but on absolute power, a place where human life held no value beyond immediate utility. In Plaso, terror was not a byproduct of the system. It was the system itself. And from this foundation, the camp would grow even more lethal as the war entered its final, most desperate phase. Chapter 1, Segment 2. A Camp Without Limits. By late 1942, Plaso had crossed a threshold. What began as a labor camp tied to the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto was evolving into something far more dangerous. A place where there were no longer clear boundaries between work, punishment, and death. The ghetto itself was being dismantled street by street, apartment by apartment, its remaining population driven through violence and deception toward deportation. During the final actions, SS units stormed homes, dragged families into courtyards, and shot those who resisted on the spot. Children were torn from their parents. The elderly were executed where they stood. Those deemed temporarily fit for labor were marched to Plaso, carrying what little they could hold, already aware that the camp was not a refuge but a holding ground for further destruction. The journey from the ghetto to the camp was short in distance, but final in meaning. Once the gates closed behind them, return was impossible. Inside Plaso, life was stripped down to a single question asked every morning. Would you still be useful by nightfall? Prisoners were sorted not by age or family, but by their ability to work. Stonecutters, metalworkers, tailors, and laborers were assigned tasks that fed directly into the German war economy. Others were sent to meaningless, exhausting labor, hauling rocks from one end of the camp to the other, digging trenches that would later be refilled, moving debris that served no purpose except to break the body. Hunger became constant. Rations were calculated not to sustain life, but to slow death just enough to extract more labor. Illness was treated as failure. Those who collapsed were beaten. Those who could not rise were removed. The camp structure reinforced this reality. Barracks were overcrowded beyond capacity. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Water was scarce. Lice-infested clothing was worn until it disintegrated. Disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, and medical care consisted mainly of selection. Those deemed too weak were marked for execution or transport. There was no quarantine, no protection, no pause. Death blended seamlessly into daily routine. Bodies were left where they fell until work details were ordered to remove them. Prisoners learned quickly not to react. Grief was dangerous. Attention was lethal. Plaszo's violence was not random chaos. It followed a logic rooted in absolute control. Public punishments were staged deliberately. Prisoners were forced to watch executions, beatings, and hangings. These spectacles served a single purpose: to erase resistance before it could form. The camp functioned as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Fear governed every movement. Silence became a survival strategy. Even friendships were dangerous, as association could mean collective punishment. Trust eroded. Isolation deepened. Commandant Amon Göth intensified this atmosphere to an extreme rarely matched elsewhere. Göth's presence was unpredictable and omnipresent. Prisoners never knew when he would appear on horseback, on foot, or watching from the balcony of his villa. He shot without warning, often for no stated reason. A poorly made bed, a moment of hesitation, a perceived act of disrespect could end in death. His authority was unchecked. Reports of murder were ignored or praised. Under his rule, guards competed in cruelty, knowing violence brought favor rather than punishment. The camp became a stage where power was proven through brutality. As deportations continued, Plaso became increasingly linked to the wider extermination system. Trains arrived and departed regularly, carrying prisoners to Auschwitz-Birkenau and other camps. Selection was constant. Those who weakened were removed. Those who resisted were executed. Entire groups disappeared overnight. Prisoners learned that survival was temporary, conditional, and always fragile. Even productivity offered no guarantee. Work delayed death, it did not prevent it. By early 1943, Plaso was no longer merely supporting genocide. It was actively participating in it. The camp absorbed prisoners from surrounding regions, expanding beyond its original purpose. Mass graves filled nearby fields. Later, as evidence began to concern German authorities, bodies were exhumed and burned in open-air pits, the smoke drifting over Krakow as a warning and a denial at the same time. The camp stood as proof that extermination did not require industrial gas chambers alone. It could be achieved through domination, exhaustion, and terror, methodically applied, day after day. In this environment, Plaso became a place without limits. There were no fixed rules, no stable expectations, no moral boundaries. Only power and survival. And as the war continued, the camp would grow even more ruthless, transforming from a site of forced labor into a central instrument of annihilation, feeding prisoners into the machinery of death until nothing remained but silence and ash. Chapter 1. Segment 3. Terror as Routine. By the time Plaso entered its third phase of existence, terror was no longer an event. It was routine. What shocked new arrivals quickly became the background rhythm of life inside the camp. The crack of rifle shots in the distance, the screams carried by the wind, the sight of bodies lying where work had stopped. Prisoners learned that there would be no investigation, no explanation, no justice. Death did not require accusation. It required only opportunity. In this environment, survival depended not on innocence or guilt, but on remaining unnoticed for as long as possible. Daily life followed a brutal cycle designed to erase individuality. Roll calls stretched for hours, regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless in rain, snow, or heat while guards counted and recounted them, often as a form of punishment rather than necessity. Anyone who collapsed was dragged out of line and beaten or shot. These assemblies served a purpose beyond discipline. They reinforced the truth that time itself belonged to the SS. Prisoners did not control their bodies, their movements, or even the moment of their death. Work details filled the remainder of the day. Some prisoners labored in stone quarries, others in workshops, construction sites, or road crews. Tasks were deliberately exhausting and frequently pointless. Carrying stones from one location to another, then back again. Digging trenches that were later filled. Scraping frozen ground with bare hands. The goal was not efficiency, but depletion. Every calorie burned, every muscle torn, every injury untreated brought prisoners closer to collapse. When they could no longer work, they were removed, quietly or violently. Punishment was arbitrary and public. Guards beat prisoners with rifle butts, whips, and wooden clubs. Collective punishment was common. If one person was accused of disobedience, an entire block could be deprived of food or forced to stand outside all night. This strategy destroyed solidarity. Hunger turned prisoners inward. Fear isolated them. The camp functioned by breaking bonds before they could become resistance. Executions were carried out openly. Prisoners were forced to witness hangings, shootings, and beatings that ended in death. These acts were not hidden. They were staged. The message was clear. The SS did not need secrecy here. Power was absolute. Even burial was denied dignity. Bodies were left exposed, sometimes for days, until work details were ordered to remove them. Death became so frequent that it lost its shock, which was precisely the intention. The camp's geography reinforced this domination. Plaso was built on the site of 2 Jewish cemeteries. Gravestones were torn from the ground and used as paving stones, construction material, or steps. Prisoners walked across the broken remains of their own dead ancestors, a deliberate act of desecration meant to erase memory as well as life. The camp itself was a message. Nothing sacred would be respected, nothing preserved. Command authority ensured that brutality escalated rather than diminished. Under SS leadership, cruelty was rewarded. Guards who displayed excessive violence were praised. Those who hesitated were replaced. There were no restraints, no oversight, no accountability. The camp became a laboratory of unchecked power, where human beings were reduced to numbers, and numbers were reduced until they reached zero. Deportations continued relentlessly. Prisoners weakened by starvation or illness were selected and removed, often under the pretense of relocation. Few believed the lie, but resistance was impossible. Trains departed regularly toward extermination camps, carrying those no longer considered useful. Each departure left behind silence and fear. Everyone knew another selection would follow. Despite this, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread. They whispered warnings before inspections. They memorized names, faces, stories. Acts of remembrance carried out quietly, dangerously. These small gestures did not stop the machinery of death, but they challenged its final goal: total erasure. To remember was to resist. By the end of this phase, Plaso had fully transformed. It was no longer merely a destination for the survivors of the Krakow ghetto. It had become a node in the Holocaust itself, a place where terror was not episodic but systematic, where violence was not chaotic but normalized, where death did not arrive suddenly, but crept forward day by day, measured in hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Plaso did not need gas chambers to function as a killing site. It relied instead on control, deprivation, and the certainty that no one inside mattered. And as the camp continued to expand, drawing prisoners from across occupied Poland, this system would only intensify, tightening its grip until even survival felt temporary, borrowed, and already slipping away. Chapter 2, Segment 1. From Ghetto to Camp. The creation of Plaso as a concentration camp did not happen suddenly. It was the result of a calculated transition, a shift from visible urban repression to controlled, industrialized terror on the outskirts of Krakow. By late 1942, the Krakow ghetto was already dying. Starvation, deportations, and random executions had reduced its population dramatically. The Nazi administration no longer saw the ghetto as efficient. It was crowded, difficult to control, and too visible. What they wanted next was distance, isolation, and total authority. Plaso was the answer. Located several kilometers south of Kraków, the site chosen for the camp had two advantages. It was remote enough to conceal large-scale violence, and it sat atop land already desecrated by ideology. Two Jewish cemeteries that were deliberately destroyed to make way for the camp. Gravestones were smashed, bodies were unearthed, and sacred ground was converted into infrastructure. This act was not incidental. It was symbolic. The Nazis were not only removing people from the city, they were erasing history itself. Construction of the camp relied almost entirely on forced Jewish labor. Prisoners from the Kraków ghetto were marched daily to the site and ordered to build their own place of confinement. Barracks, fences, guard towers, roads, and execution sites were erected by hands already weakened by hunger and fear. There were no protective tools, no adequate clothing, no rest. Injuries were common. Deaths were accepted. The camp took shape not through engineering efficiency, but through expendable bodies. As Plaso expanded, its purpose became clearer. It was not initially classified as an extermination camp, but its function aligned closely with the logic of destruction. It served as a holding site for Jews awaiting deportation to Belzec, Auschwitz, or Sobibor, while simultaneously exploiting their labor until they were no longer useful. Survival here was temporary by design. The camp existed in the space between ghetto and death camp, a corridor of prolonged suffering. The liquidation of the Kraków ghetto in March 1943 marked Plaszo's transformation. Over 2 brutal days, SS and police units emptied the ghetto through mass shootings, forced marches, and deportations. Those deemed fit for labor were driven to Plaso. The elderly, children, and the sick were murdered on the spot or sent directly to extermination camps. What remained of Krakow's Jewish population was concentrated behind barbed wire under full SS control. This influx overwhelmed the camp immediately. Barracks were unfinished. Sanitation was non-existent. Food rations were insufficient even by camp standards. Prisoners slept on bare floors, crowded together for warmth. Disease spread rapidly. Lice, typhus, dysentery, all flourished in conditions deliberately allowed to decay. Medical care was not intended to heal. It existed only to determine who could continue working and who would be removed. Administrative order masked the chaos. Prisoners were registered, numbered, categorized. Political prisoners, Jews, and later non-Jewish detainees were separated into blocks, each subject to different rules and levels of brutality. This classification system created hierarchy among prisoners, a tool that further fractured solidarity and increased competition for survival. The camp did not rely solely on SS violence. It relied on division. Plaso's command structure reinforced this brutality. The camp commander exercised unchecked authority, operating with near-total autonomy. Orders were vague by design, allowing violence to be justified after the fact. A beating could be punishment. A shooting could be discipline. A massacre could be framed as security. There were no consequences for excess. In fact, cruelty became proof of loyalty. Labor assignments defined daily existence. Prisoners were forced into quarry work, construction, road building, and camp maintenance. Tasks were intentionally punishing. Tools were scarce. Deadlines were impossible. Guards measured output without regard for human limits. When productivity dropped, violence followed. When someone collapsed, they were replaced. The system required a steady flow of bodies, not skilled workers. What distinguished this phase of Plaso was its transition from temporary holding camp to permanent mechanism of terror. Deportations continued, but increasingly the camp itself became a site of death. Executions rose. Punishments escalated. Fear became constant. Prisoners no longer spoke of survival in months or weeks, but in days, sometimes hours. Every morning roll call carried the unspoken question of who would not return. And yet, beneath this crushing system, memory persisted. Prisoners whispered names of streets that no longer existed. They remembered holidays they could no longer observe. They carried fragments of identity into a place designed to strip identity away. These acts were dangerous, but they mattered, because Plaso was not only trying to kill bodies, it was trying to erase the idea that these lives had ever mattered at all. By the end of this stage, Plaso stood fully formed, no longer an extension of the ghetto, but its replacement. A closed world where the rules of humanity no longer applied. A camp built not just to contain, but to exhaust, terrorize, and dispose of those trapped within it. And as the war continued to turn against Nazi Germany, the violence inside Plaso would only intensify, driven by desperation, ideology, and the knowledge that time was running out. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Command, Terror, and the Logic of Cruelty. Once Plaso was fully established, its character was defined not only by barbed wire and labor details, but by the men who ruled it, and by a system that rewarded cruelty as competence. At the center of this world stood the camp commandant, whose authority over life and death was absolute. There were no meaningful inspections, no legal restraints, and no moral limits. The camp was governed by ideology and impulse, backed by SS power. What happened inside Plaso rarely needed justification. Violence was not an exception to the rules. It was the rule. Daily life unfolded under constant uncertainty. Prisoners woke before dawn to shouting, whistles, and beatings. Roll call could last for hours, regardless of weather, illness, or collapse. Those who fell were kicked back to their feet or dragged aside. Sometimes roll call ended with selections. Prisoners pulled from the ranks without explanation, never to be seen again. At other times, it ended with nothing more than exhaustion. The unpredictability itself was deliberate. Fear worked best when no pattern could be learned. The camp's internal order relied heavily on prisoner functionaries, capos, block elders, and work supervisors, appointed by the SS and given limited authority over others. These roles offered marginal advantages: slightly more food, temporary protection from arbitrary violence, but they came at a cost. Functionaries were expected to enforce discipline, maintain productivity, and deliver punishment when ordered. Refusal meant replacement, often through death. This system forced prisoners into moral compromise, turning survival into collaboration under duress. It fractured solidarity and deepened isolation. Punishment in Plaso was public and theatrical. Executions were often carried out in full view of other prisoners to reinforce obedience. Beatings were staged as warnings. Hangings were announced as lessons. The camp commander frequently conducted shootings personally, from balconies or elevated positions, transforming murder into spectacle. These acts were not hidden. They were meant to be seen, remembered, and feared. Terror was a tool, and visibility made it sharper. Work details intensified as the camp expanded. Prisoners were assigned to construction projects, quarries, warehouses, workshops, and maintenance tasks that supported both the camp and the surrounding SS infrastructure. Labor was deliberately exhausting. Rest periods were rare. Injuries were ignored. Those who could no longer work were not rehabilitated, they were removed. Sometimes this meant execution inside the camp. Sometimes deportation to Auschwitz. Either way, the outcome was the same. Labor was not a path to survival. It was a countdown. Food rations reflected this logic. Meals were calculated not to sustain life, but to extract short-term productivity. Watery soup, moldy bread, occasional scraps, never enough, never consistent. Hunger became a permanent condition. Prisoners scavenged for peelings, chewed grass, stole when possible. Theft was punishable by death, but starvation was slower. The camp forced prisoners to choose between immediate risk and prolonged suffering. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Overcrowding worsened as transports arrived from other ghettos and camps. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, all thrived in conditions the SS made no effort to control. Medical care existed only as selection. Camp doctors did not heal. They categorized. The sick were marked, isolated, and removed. Illness became a death sentence, not because it was untreatable, but because treatment was never intended. Psychological terror worked alongside physical brutality. Prisoners were forbidden to mourn, forbidden to gather, forbidden to speak freely. Names were replaced with numbers. Personal possessions were confiscated. Identity was stripped layer by layer. The goal was not only obedience but internal collapse, a state in which prisoners no longer believed they deserved to live. Despair was cultivated as carefully as fear. And yet, even within this environment, moments of humanity survived, fragile, dangerous, and fleeting. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread. They whispered warnings. They remembered birthdays, prayers, fragments of poetry. These acts were small, but they mattered, because Plaso was designed not only to kill bodies, but to erase dignity. Every act of care was an act of resistance. As 1943 turned into 1944, the camp grew deadlier. Deportations increased. Executions became more frequent. The SS sensed the war turning against them, and violence escalated accordingly. Witnesses had to be controlled. Prisoners had to be exhausted. Order had to be maintained through terror, not efficiency. The system tightened, feeding on its own brutality. Plaso was no longer merely a transit camp or labor site. It had become a self-contained universe of punishment, a place where cruelty was normalized, bureaucracy protected murder, and suffering was measured in quotas and schedules. Every day inside the camp reinforced the same lesson. Survival depended not on innocence, strength, or merit, but on chance, and even chance was running out. This was the logic of Plaso. Not chaos, but organized terror. Not random violence, but systematic degradation. A camp where the rules were clear in only one way. Life was temporary, and death was always close. And as the front lines moved closer to Krakow, the SS would begin preparing for the camp's final phase. One that would bring both intensified killing and desperate attempts to erase what had been done. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Deportation, Exhaustion, and the camp as a dead end. By the time Plaso entered its full operational phase, the camp had become more than a place of terror and forced labor. It had become a sorting mechanism, a node within the wider machinery of the Holocaust, designed to drain life from those who passed through it and redirect what remained toward extermination. Prisoners quickly understood that Plaso was not a destination. It was a narrowing corridor, and at the end of it stood Auschwitz. Transports arrived constantly. Jews from Krakow, surrounding towns, liquidated ghettos, and other camps were pushed into Plaso with little explanation. Many believed they were being relocated for work. Others already knew better. Upon arrival, selections began almost immediately. The SS evaluated bodies the way factory managers inspected tools, strength, speed, appearance. The young and able were assigned to labor details. The elderly, the weak, the sick, and children were often separated and removed within days or even hours. For many, the first night in Plaso was also the last. Those deemed temporarily useful entered a cycle of exhaustion that allowed no recovery. Workdays stretched endlessly. Tasks were deliberately inefficient, repetitive, and physically destructive. Stone hauling, earth leveling, construction under constant abuse, none of it was meant to be completed efficiently. Productivity was measured not by results, but by how much suffering could be extracted before collapse. Injuries were common and untreated. A broken limb, an infected wound, or a fever did not excuse absence. It accelerated removal. Deportations to Auschwitz became a constant threat hanging over the camp. Rumors circulated. Whispers passed between barracks. Prisoners learned to recognize the signs. Lists being prepared, guards behaving differently, sudden inspections. When deportations occurred, they were brutal and chaotic. Prisoners were rounded up, beaten into lines, packed into trains, and sent east. The SS described these transports as resettlement. Prisoners understood them as death sentences. The knowledge of Auschwitz shaped behavior inside Plaso. Some prisoners worked beyond exhaustion to avoid selection. Others deliberately hid illness, even as it worsened. Parents tried to disguise children as older. Friends exchanged clothing to make one another appear stronger. These efforts rarely succeeded, but they reveal the psychological landscape of the camp, a place where survival required constant calculation under impossible conditions. As the camp population grew, overcrowding became extreme. Barracks designed for hundreds held thousands. Sleep was fragmented and unsafe. Prisoners lay pressed together, bodies stacked on wooden bunks or bare floors. Lice and rats spread freely. Disease followed density. Typhus outbreaks swept through sections of the camp, killing indiscriminately. The SS responded not with sanitation or medical aid, but with selections. Illness became a filter, not a problem to be solved. Medical facilities existed in name only. The infirmary was a place of waiting, not healing. Prisoners knew that reporting sickness often meant being marked for deportation or execution. Many chose to work until they collapsed rather than risk being labeled unfit. Doctors, operating under SS authority, categorized bodies as useful or expendable. Treatment was irrelevant. Classification was everything. Psychological degradation deepened. Prisoners were forced to witness the removal of friends, family members, and entire barracks. Death became routine, expected, normalized. Grief had no space to exist. There were no funerals, no markers, no pauses. Bodies were removed quickly to maintain order and appearance. The living were expected to continue working, eating, and obeying as if nothing had happened. Children suffered uniquely. Though Plaso was not designed as a family camp, children were imprisoned there nonetheless, hidden, smuggled, or temporarily spared. They endured starvation, violence, and terror without understanding the rules that governed their fate. Many were taken in selections or deported with little notice. Survival for children depended almost entirely on adult protection and luck, both of which were fragile and temporary. By late 1943 and into 1944, the camp's role within the Nazi system intensified. As other camps were liquidated or overwhelmed, Plaso absorbed prisoners at an accelerating pace. The SS faced pressure to maintain output while preparing for the possibility of retreat. This tension produced even harsher conditions. Violence increased. Deportations became more frequent. The margin for survival narrowed further. At the same time, the SS began quietly planning for erasure. Records were altered. Witnesses were removed. Prisoners with knowledge of camp operations were targeted. The camp was expected to function until the last possible moment, extracting labor, enforcing terror, and feeding Auschwitz, and then disappear without accountability. Plaso was not meant to leave evidence behind. It was meant to leave emptiness. Yet even as the system tightened, traces of resistance persisted. Prisoners shared information. Some sabotaged work subtly. Others documented names, dates, and events in secret, understanding that survival alone was not enough. Memory mattered. These acts were dangerous and rare, but they represented a refusal to let the camp define the entirety of human behavior within its walls. Plaso, by this stage, had fully revealed its purpose. It was not merely a labor camp, nor solely a place of terror. It was a mechanism of attrition, designed to wear bodies down, sort the living from the dying, and send the rest toward annihilation. There was no future inside Plaso, only delay. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany, the camp would enter its final phase, one marked by frantic violence, mass deportations, and attempts to erase the past. For the prisoners still alive, the question was no longer whether death was coming, but from which direction: exhaustion, execution, or the trains heading east. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Commandant, the System, and Rule by Terror. By the time Plaso entered its third year of operation, terror was no longer incidental. It was structured, intentional, and personalized. The camp had developed a governing logic, one enforced not only by regulations and routines, but by the will of its commandant, Amon Göth. Under his control, Plaso became a place where violence was not simply permitted, but ritualized, where cruelty functioned as both punishment and entertainment, and where authority was asserted through unpredictable death. Göth's arrival marked a decisive shift in how the camp operated. While brutality had existed from the beginning, it now became centralized and theatrical. Prisoners learned quickly that survival depended not just on obedience, but on navigating the moods and impulses of a man who exercised absolute power over life and death. Göth ruled from a villa overlooking the camp, elevated both physically and symbolically above the prisoners below. From this vantage point, he observed roll calls, labor details, and movements, and sometimes killed prisoners with a rifle simply because they were visible. This form of violence served a purpose. Randomness was a weapon. When punishment follows predictable rules, prisoners can adapt. When punishment arrives without reason, adaptation becomes impossible. Göth understood this. Executions occurred without trial, explanation, or warning. A misstep during roll call, a perceived delay in work, a glance interpreted as disrespect. Any of these could result in death. Often, no justification was offered at all. Public executions were frequent and deliberate. Prisoners were forced to watch as others were shot, hanged, or beaten to death. These spectacles reinforced a central message. Nothing protected you. Not compliance. Not productivity. Not silence. Terror was not a response to resistance. It was the foundation of control. The SS hierarchy beneath Göth followed his example. Guards competed in cruelty. Capos, prisoner functionaries elevated to enforce discipline, were often selected for their willingness to abuse others. This system fractured solidarity among prisoners, turning survival into a zero-sum struggle. Those who enforced discipline were rewarded with marginal privileges. Extra food, lighter work, temporary safety. But these privileges were unstable. A capo could be executed as easily as the prisoners beneath him. Violence extended beyond physical harm. Psychological terror was constant. Prisoners were subjected to humiliations designed to strip identity and dignity. Names were replaced with numbers. Shaving, beatings, and forced nudity were routine. Language itself became a tool of domination, as orders were shouted, insults repeated, and threats embedded into daily communication. Fear saturated every interaction. Women imprisoned in Plaso faced specific forms of terror layered atop the general brutality of camp life. Sexual violence, harassment, and exploitation were widespread. Female prisoners were vulnerable to abuse by guards and capos alike, with no recourse and no protection. Pregnancy was treated as a crime. Mothers were separated from children. Survival required not only endurance, but constant vigilance against violations that were normalized within the camp's power structure. Children, though fewer in number, existed in a state of permanent precarity. Some were hidden by adults. Others were used for labor despite their age. Many were eventually deported or killed. Childhood offered no protection. In Plaso, age did not determine value, usefulness did. The administrative machinery of the camp continued to function alongside this chaos. Records were kept. Labor quotas were tracked. Deportation lists were prepared. The coexistence of paperwork and violence revealed the true nature of the system. Cruelty did not replace bureaucracy. It operated through it. Forms legitimized decisions. Orders transformed murder into procedure. Medical abuse also intensified during this period. Prison doctors participated in selections, experiments, and neglect. Treatment was rarely intended to heal. It served classification. Bodies were examined to determine whether they could still work. Those who could not were removed. The medical system existed to maximize labor extraction, not to preserve life. Göth's authority extended beyond the camp perimeter. He oversaw the liquidation of nearby ghettos and coordinated deportations. His power was reinforced by the broader Nazi system, which rewarded efficiency and obedience regardless of method. Reports sent upward emphasized productivity and order, while violence was framed as discipline. Accountability did not exist. Success was measured by output and control. Yet even within this environment, cracks appeared. Prisoners observed inconsistencies. They noticed moments when orders conflicted, when guards hesitated, when the system revealed its dependence on fear rather than strength. Small acts of resistance emerged. Slowed work, hidden tools, whispered warnings. These actions were dangerous and often fatal, but they represented a refusal to surrender entirely to the camp's logic. The terror of Plaso during this phase was not merely personal. It was systemic. Göth embodied it, but he did not invent it. He operated within a structure that rewarded brutality and delegated moral responsibility upward until no one claimed it. Violence became routine because it was functional. It maintained order. It extracted labor. It eliminated those deemed unnecessary. By the end of this period, Plaso had fully transformed into a camp where terror itself was the governing principle. Not as chaos, but as method. Fear replaced law. Death replaced discipline. And survival became an act of continuous negotiation with forces designed to eliminate it. The next phase would bring escalation. As the war turned against Germany and the SS intensified deportations, executions, and erasures, Plaso would not soften as defeat approached. It would become more lethal, more frantic, and more determined to leave nothing behind. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Daily life inside a camp designed to break the human mind. Life inside Plaso did not follow a rhythm meant to sustain the body or the spirit. It followed a rhythm designed to exhaust, confuse, and slowly dismantle every sense of normality. From the moment prisoners woke before dawn to the moment they collapsed onto wooden planks at night, every hour was shaped by deprivation, fear, and uncertainty. There was no stable routine, and that instability itself was intentional. When prisoners could not predict what came next, they could not prepare, organize, or resist. Mornings began with roll call, often lasting for hours regardless of weather. Prisoners stood motionless in mud, snow, rain, or heat while SS guards counted, recounted, and punished at will. Those who collapsed from weakness were beaten or shot. Sometimes corpses were propped upright to keep numbers correct. Roll call was not simply administrative. It was a daily demonstration of power, a reminder that time itself belonged to the camp. Food was starvation by design. Rations consisted of thin soup, scraps of bread, and occasionally a substitute coffee made from burned grains. Caloric intake was far below what the human body required, especially for prisoners assigned to hard labor. Hunger became a constant presence, dull at first, then sharp, then consuming. Prisoners spoke of thinking about food endlessly, of dreaming of meals, of losing the ability to focus on anything else. Hunger altered behavior, eroded empathy, and turned survival into a solitary calculation. Labor assignments varied, but all were brutal. Prisoners worked in stone quarries, construction crews, workshops, warehouses, and SS projects. The workday stretched from early morning until exhaustion forced bodies to stop. Guards measured productivity without regard for human limits. Falling behind meant beatings, punishment details, or death. Rest was treated as defiance. Injury was treated as failure. The camp itself expanded through prisoner labor. Barracks, roads, fences, and SS buildings were constructed by those imprisoned within them. Prisoners built the infrastructure of their own confinement, often aware that completion only meant the arrival of more transports and more suffering. This circular cruelty reinforced a sense of futility. Nothing built here would ever improve life. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce. Washing was irregular or impossible. Lice spread rapidly, carrying disease. Typhus, dysentery, and infections flourished in overcrowded barracks where bodies were packed together with no ventilation. Illness became another form of selection. Those who grew too weak were removed, often deported, executed, or left to die without treatment. Sleep offered little relief. Barracks were overcrowded, with prisoners packed tightly on wooden bunks or floors. Noise never fully stopped. Coughing, crying, whispered prayers, and screams carried through the night. Guards conducted sudden inspections, dragging prisoners outside for punishment or execution. Night became another extension of fear rather than a pause from it. Psychological erosion was constant. Prisoners were stripped not only of possessions, but of identity. Hair was shaved. Clothing was uniform and inadequate. Names were replaced with numbers. Personal history, profession, family, none of it mattered inside the camp. The system worked to reduce individuals to interchangeable units of labor. Communication was dangerous but essential. Prisoners whispered warnings about violent guards, upcoming selections, or labor details known to be fatal. These fragments of shared knowledge could mean survival, but they also carried risk. Informants existed. Trust was fragile. Still, human connection persisted. Quiet acts of kindness, shared crumbs of bread, moments of recognition that affirmed existence beyond the camp's definitions. Punishment was arbitrary and theatrical. Prisoners were beaten publicly, forced to stand for hours, hung by their arms, or subjected to exhausting drills. These punishments were often disconnected from any specific offense. Their purpose was not correction, but intimidation. When punishment has no logic, obedience loses meaning. Fear becomes absolute. Women prisoners endured additional layers of suffering. Alongside forced labor and starvation, they faced constant vulnerability to sexual abuse, harassment, and exploitation. Pregnancy was treated as a violation of camp order. Mothers were separated from children. Survival required navigating not only hunger and labor, but constant threat to bodily autonomy. Children existed at the margins of survival. Some were hidden by adults, disguised during roll calls, or shielded during selections. Others were used for labor despite their age. Many were eventually deported or killed. Childhood provided no protection in a system that measured value solely through labor capacity. Despite everything, the camp never fully erased human response. Prisoners adapted in small ways, saving energy where possible, trading skills, forming fragile support networks. These actions did not overthrow the system, but they resisted its goal of total domination. To share food, to help a weaker prisoner stand during roll call, to remember one's name. These were acts of defiance in a place built to erase defiance entirely. The cruelty of daily life in Plaso was not accidental. It was engineered. Every deprivation, every delay, every humiliation served a purpose: to exhaust bodies, fracture solidarity, and maintain control with minimal resources. The camp did not rely on constant violence alone. It relied on the slow accumulation of suffering, day after day, until resistance seemed impossible. Yet as this system intensified, it also revealed its dependence on fear and labor. And where dependence exists, vulnerability follows. In the next phase, as the war shifted and German defeat loomed, the camp's routines would grow harsher and more frantic. Deportations would accelerate. Executions would increase. And the illusion of order would begin to crack, violently and irrevocably. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Terror as Routine. Violence, execution, and the normalization of death. By the time prisoners understood the daily rhythms of Plaso, one truth had become unavoidable. Violence was not an exception in this camp, it was the structure. Terror was not reserved for moments of rebellion or disorder. It was woven deliberately into ordinary life, transforming fear into a constant condition and death into something routine, expected, and terrifyingly casual. Plaso functioned not only as a labor camp, but as a landscape where human life held no inherent value, and where killing required neither justification nor explanation. Executions occurred openly and frequently. Prisoners were shot in full view of others, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, often without warning. A guard might stop a work detail, point at a prisoner, and end a life in seconds. No charges were read, no questions asked. The randomness was intentional. When death has no predictable cause, survival becomes a matter of chance rather than behavior. This uncertainty paralyzed resistance and eroded any belief that obedience alone could guarantee life. The execution grounds became familiar places. Prisoners learned their locations, learned to avert their eyes, learned the sound of gunfire as part of the camp's daily noise. Bodies were sometimes left where they fell for hours or days, serving as silent warnings. Other times, prisoners were forced to carry corpses away, dig graves, or bury fellow inmates in mass pits. These tasks were designed not only to dispose of bodies, but to implicate the living in the machinery of death. Public punishment served a similar function. Prisoners were beaten until unconscious, hung by their arms, whipped, or forced into exhausting physical drills while guards watched and laughed. These acts were staged as spectacles. The camp gathered to witness suffering, reinforcing the message that power was absolute and mercy non-existent. Watching another human being broken became unavoidable, and over time, shock gave way to numbness, another form of psychological control. One of the most feared figures in this system was the camp commandant, whose presence amplified terror beyond even the SS structure itself. His violence was personal, unpredictable, and theatrical. He shot prisoners from balconies, selected victims at random, and treated killing as entertainment. Prisoners learned to recognize his footsteps, his moods, his silences. Survival sometimes depended on avoiding his line of sight. Other times, nothing could be done. His authority embodied the camp's philosophy: absolute power exercised without restraint or accountability. Women prisoners were especially vulnerable to this personalized violence. Sexual abuse, coercion, and humiliation occurred under the constant threat of punishment or death. Refusal was impossible. Reporting abuse was unthinkable. The camp's power structure ensured silence, leaving victims isolated and unprotected. These violations were not aberrations. They were enabled by a system that stripped prisoners of legal and moral recognition. The camp also functioned as a transit point for mass murder. Prisoners deemed too weak to work, too ill to recover, or simply unnecessary were removed through selections. These selections were carried out with cold efficiency. Prisoners were ordered to line up, inspected briefly, and sorted. Those selected disappeared, deported to extermination camps or executed nearby. The process reinforced a constant awareness that survival was temporary and conditional. Children were not spared. Some were executed immediately upon arrival. Others survived briefly, hidden or assigned minor tasks, until discovered or selected. Their presence intensified the cruelty of the camp, confronting prisoners with the collapse of any remaining moral boundaries. Childhood, which should have symbolized protection and future, became another category of expendability. As executions increased, so did the use of mass graves. The camp expanded over former Jewish cemeteries, turning sacred ground into killing fields. Bodies were buried without ceremony, without identification, without acknowledgement. Later, as German defeat loomed, efforts were made to exhume and burn corpses in an attempt to erase evidence. Prisoners were forced to destroy the remains of those already murdered, extending the violence beyond death itself. Despite this, death never became truly ordinary for those who lived under its shadow. Fear remained sharp, even when exhaustion dulled reaction. Prisoners remembered names, faces, last words. They carried these memories silently, often unable to mourn openly but refusing to forget. In a system designed to erase identity, memory became an act of resistance. Some prisoners attempted subtle defiance, slowing work, sharing information, sabotaging equipment when possible. These acts were dangerous and often punished severely, but they represented a refusal to surrender completely. Resistance did not always mean uprising. Sometimes it meant surviving one more day, preserving a fragment of dignity in a place built to destroy dignity entirely. The terror of Plaso was not chaotic. It was methodical. Violence followed patterns, served functions, and reinforced hierarchy. Guards were trained to dehumanize, to view prisoners as material rather than people. Orders were obeyed not because they were justified, but because the system rewarded obedience and punished doubt. In this way, cruelty became normalized not only among perpetrators, but within the structure itself. As the war continued and German losses mounted, the camp's violence intensified. Executions increased. Selections became more frequent. Deportations accelerated. The illusion of control began to fray, replaced by desperation and brutality. The system that relied on terror now depended on it entirely. Yet this escalation also revealed something else. Fear was the camp's foundation, but it was also its weakness. Terror required constant enforcement. Without it, the system could not function. And as external pressure grew and the war turned against Germany, cracks began to form. Cracks that would soon force the camp into its most chaotic and deadly phase. In the next chapter, we follow Plaso as it enters this final transformation, from a place of organized terror to one of frantic destruction, where the regime attempted to erase its crimes, and prisoners were pushed into death marches, deportations, and last acts of survival as liberation approached. Chapter 4, Segment 1, Expansion and Exploitation. Plaso as a key node in the Nazi war machine. By the time Plaso entered its next phase, the camp had moved far beyond its original purpose. What began as a forced labor site tied to the destruction of the Krakow ghetto evolved into a critical component of the Nazi war economy, a place where terror, industry, and bureaucracy merged into a single system of exploitation. This transformation did not reduce violence. Instead, it refined it, embedding cruelty into production schedules, labor quotas, and administrative routines that treated human lives as expendable resources. As Germany's war effort intensified, the demand for labor grew desperate. Bombing raids, battlefield losses, and industrial strain forced the regime to extract maximum output from every available source. Plaso became one of those sources. Prisoners were no longer valued solely for punishment or intimidation. They were now expected to produce. Stone quarries, construction sites, workshops, and later armaments-related labor absorbed thousands of inmates, each expected to work until physical collapse. Workdays stretched endlessly. Prisoners labored from before dawn until nightfall, often without adequate food, clothing, or rest. Injuries were common and rarely treated. A crushed hand, a broken leg, or a festering wound was not a medical concern. It was a liability. Those unable to work were removed through selections, deported, or executed. Productivity became a measure of worth, and failure to meet expectations carried fatal consequences. The expansion of forced labor also meant the expansion of control. Detailed records were kept, numbers assigned, tasks tracked, output measured. Bureaucracy replaced overt brutality in some areas, but the result was the same. Paperwork masked suffering. Forms, signatures, and reports transformed exploitation into something orderly, even respectable, within the administrative logic of the Reich. The system did not require sadism to function, only compliance. Subcamps and external labor detachments grew rapidly. Prisoners were sent to factories, quarries, and construction projects across the region, often under SS supervision but sometimes guarded by civilian contractors. This blurred the boundary between camp and society. Ordinary businesses benefited from forced labor. Civilians saw prisoners march through streets, emaciated and beaten, yet production continued. Silence became another form of participation. Within the camp, hierarchy among prisoners hardened. Capos, inmates placed in supervisory roles, enforced discipline under threat of punishment themselves. Some abused their power brutally, while others attempted to shield fellow prisoners when possible. The system encouraged moral compromise, forcing prisoners into impossible choices: obey and survive a little longer, or resist and risk immediate death. The camp thrived on these divisions, weakening solidarity and deepening despair. Women prisoners were increasingly exploited for labor as well. Assigned to workshops, sorting details, and construction support, they faced not only exhaustion but constant vulnerability to abuse. Pregnancy often resulted in immediate execution or deportation. Motherhood was treated as defiance against camp logic. Children born in or brought into the camp rarely survived long. As Plaso expanded, its physical landscape changed. Barracks multiplied. Execution sites were integrated into work zones. Graves appeared near labor areas, collapsing the distance between production and death. Prisoners worked beside mass burial pits, aware that their labor fed a system that would eventually consume them as well. The camp's command structure ensured that brutality remained consistent. Orders flowed downward, violence flowed outward. Guards rotated, but policies remained unchanged. Punishment for sabotage or slow work was immediate and public. Even accidental damage to tools could be interpreted as resistance. The camp required constant proof of obedience, and fear remained the primary motivator. At the same time, Plaso became a transit hub. Prisoners were transferred in from dissolved ghettos and other camps, swelling numbers beyond capacity. Each arrival brought fresh confusion, fresh terror. New prisoners learned quickly, usually through witnessing punishment, that survival depended on silence, endurance, and luck. The camp absorbed them without pause, feeding them directly into labor details or death. Yet even within this machine, cracks began to show. The sheer scale of exploitation strained logistics. Food shortages worsened. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks. Guards grew harsher as control became harder to maintain. The camp was producing, but at a cost that even its administrators struggled to manage. Still, production continued. The war demanded it, and Plaso delivered not through efficiency, but through relentless destruction of human bodies. Each day of labor shortened lives, each quota met by exhaustion rather than skill. The system accepted this trade without hesitation. What Plaso revealed in this phase was a central truth of the Holocaust. Genocide was not only carried out through killing, but through work itself. Labor became a weapon. Exhaustion became execution delayed. The camp did not need gas chambers to function as a site of mass death. It needed schedules, overseers, and the belief that some lives existed solely to be used up. As the war shifted and German defeat loomed closer, the role of Plaso would change again. The system that once sought order would soon descend into chaos, as the regime attempted to erase evidence, evacuate prisoners, and preserve power in the face of collapse. In the next segment, we follow that transition, as exploitation gives way to desperation, and Plaso enters its most lethal and unstable chapter. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Daily Life Inside the System, Starvation, Discipline, and Manufactured Fear. By the time Plaso had fully transformed into an industrial labor camp, daily life inside its fences followed a grim and carefully enforced rhythm. Every hour was structured to extract labor, enforce submission, and reinforce terror. Nothing inside the camp was accidental. Hunger, exhaustion, violence, and uncertainty were not side effects. They were tools. Each day began before sunrise. Prisoners were ripped from sleep by shouted orders, whistles, and blows. Roll call followed, regardless of weather. Men and women stood motionless for hours in rain, snow, or extreme heat, their bodies shaking from cold or weakness. Those who collapsed were dragged out of line, beaten, or killed. The purpose was not only to count prisoners, but to break them before the day even began. Food was deliberately insufficient. Rations consisted of watery soup, moldy bread, and occasional scraps unfit for consumption. Calorie intake rarely matched the physical demands placed on prisoners. Starvation was slow, methodical, and intentional. Weight dropped rapidly. Muscles wasted. Immune systems failed. Hunger consumed every thought, shaping behavior, relationships, and morality. Prisoners bartered, stole, and risked punishment for crumbs. The camp ensured that desperation replaced dignity. Work details dominated the day. Prisoners marched under guard to quarries, construction sites, workshops, and industrial facilities. Tools were scarce and often broken. Protective equipment did not exist. Accidents were constant. Crushed limbs, falling stones, deep wounds, but injury brought no relief. An injured prisoner was considered useless. Those unable to continue were removed from work lines and sent for selection, a word that disguised execution or deportation. Discipline was absolute and arbitrary. Rules changed without warning. Punishment was public and theatrical. Prisoners were beaten for looking the wrong way, speaking out of turn, or failing to meet impossible expectations. Executions took place in full view, often at roll call or near work sites. The message was clear. Survival depended on obedience, but obedience offered no protection. The SS cultivated fear not only through violence, but through unpredictability. A guard's mood could mean life or death. A rumor could trigger panic. A whistle could signal punishment, transport, or execution. Prisoners lived in a constant state of tension, unable to plan beyond the next hour. Time itself became distorted, measured not in days but in survival milestones: one more roll call, one more work shift, one more night. Barracks were overcrowded beyond capacity. Prisoners slept on wooden bunks stacked in tiers, often sharing spaces meant for half the number assigned. Lice and fleas infested clothing and bedding. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Latrines overflowed. Water access was limited. Disease spread rapidly: dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis. Medical care was minimal and often lethal, as camp infirmaries served as places of neglect or selection rather than healing. Women prisoners faced additional horrors. Sexual violence was an unspoken but constant threat. Pregnant women were punished, deported, or killed. Mothers were separated from children. Female bodies were exploited for labor and subjected to humiliating inspections. Gender offered no protection, only another layer of vulnerability. Children, when present, were treated as burdens. Too weak to work, they were often marked for immediate removal. Those who survived did so through concealment, assistance from other prisoners, or sheer chance. Childhood vanished behind barbed wire. Innocence had no place in camp logic. Prisoner hierarchy intensified suffering. Capos enforced discipline under SS oversight. Some abused power to survive. Others attempted quiet resistance by easing workloads or hiding the sick. The system forced prisoners into moral traps, turning victims against one another. Trust became dangerous. Solidarity required courage few could afford. Yet even in this environment, fragments of humanity endured. Prisoners shared stories, whispered prayers, remembered names. Cultural resistance survived in secret. Songs sung under breath, lessons taught in darkness, small acts of kindness that defied camp logic. These moments did not stop the machinery, but they preserved identity against erasure. The camp's design ensured that no space was safe. Execution sites stood near barracks. Graves appeared beside work zones. Prisoners labored within sight of death, aware that collapse meant replacement. Life and death occupied the same ground, blurring into a single experience of waiting. The psychological toll was immense. Fear, grief, and exhaustion hollowed people from within. Hope became dangerous, something that could shatter without warning. Many prisoners described a numbness, a withdrawal from emotion as a survival mechanism. To feel too deeply was to break. What made daily life in Plaso especially destructive was its normalization. Terror became routine. Violence became expected. Death became background noise. The camp functioned not because it was chaotic, but because it was systematic. Each day repeated the same pattern of degradation until resistance felt impossible. This was the system at work, not a moment of madness but a sustained process. A place where cruelty was measured, enforced, and repeated with precision. And as the war began to turn against Germany, this system would grow even more dangerous. The need to maintain control would give way to panic, and panic would unleash new levels of brutality. In the next segment, we follow Plaso into that phase. As deportations accelerate, executions increase, and the camp moves closer to its violent end. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Selections, Executions, and the camp as a place of disposal. As Plaso matured into a fully operational concentration camp, it crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer only a place of labor, punishment, and terror. It became a place of disposal, where lives were sorted, removed, and erased with chilling efficiency. By this stage, Death was no longer a consequence of failure alone. It was an outcome built into the system. Selections were the camp's most feared ritual. They arrived without warning. Prisoners would be ordered to assemble, sometimes at roll call, sometimes in the barracks, sometimes directly at work sites. SS officers and camp doctors moved down the lines, making instant judgments based on appearance alone. A tremor, a limp, hollow cheeks, a cough. Any sign of weakness could mean death. There was no examination, no appeal, no explanation. Those selected were separated from the rest and told they were being transferred. The word transport carried terror. Everyone knew what it meant. Some were sent to Auschwitz. Others never left Plaso at all. Trucks drove them to execution sites hidden within or just outside the camp. Many were shot the same day. Executions were frequent, public, and deliberately visible. Prisoners were forced to watch. Hanging gallows stood within view of barracks. Shooting pits were located near work zones. Bodies were left on display for hours, sometimes days, as warnings. The SS understood that terror worked best when it was witnessed. Amon Göth personally presided over many executions. He selected victims from his balcony, from the road, even from inside his home. Prisoners recalled him shooting people casually, during inspections, after breakfast, while riding his horse. There was no protocol, no investigation, no record. His authority was absolute, and death followed his whims. Entire groups were executed at once. Political prisoners, Jews accused of sabotage, those caught with extra food, prisoners who spoke out of turn. Sometimes the offense was never explained. Punishment did not require guilt. It required example. Mass executions intensified as deportations from the Krakow ghetto and surrounding areas increased. Plaso absorbed thousands of prisoners in waves, overwhelming its capacity. With overcrowding came selection, a method to control numbers while maintaining terror. Those deemed unnecessary were removed. Children were among the most vulnerable. Too weak for labor, too visible to hide, they were often selected immediately upon arrival. Mothers were forced to watch as children were taken away. Attempts to hide them risked death for entire barracks. The camp system ensured that even love became dangerous. Execution sites became routine landmarks. Prisoners learned where death occurred. Some avoided looking. Others memorized names, faces, last words, determined to remember what the system tried to erase. Memory itself became resistance. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. At first, mass graves were used. Later, bodies were exhumed and burned as the SS attempted to conceal evidence. Prisoners were forced to participate in these processes. Digging, carrying, burning. They worked among the dead, knowing they could soon join them. This forced participation was intentional. It bound prisoners psychologically to the machinery of murder. It blurred the line between victim and witness. Survivors later described this as one of the most damaging aspects of camp life, being made to assist in erasing others. Disease further accelerated death. Starvation weakened bodies. Typhus spread unchecked. Those who fell ill were often selected rather than treated. The infirmary was not a place of healing, but a holding area for removal. Being sick meant being seen. The SS referred to this process as cleansing or reorganization. Language concealed reality. Paperwork reduced people to numbers. Lists replaced names. Orders replaced conscience. The camp operated with bureaucratic calm while executing thousands. Fear reshaped behavior. Prisoners learned to hide injuries, suppress illness, mask pain. Some stuffed rags into shoes to appear stronger. Others smeared dirt on their faces to look healthier. Survival depended on deception, not of the guards, but of the system itself. Solidarity was tested constantly. Helping another could draw attention. Sharing food could weaken both. Silence became a shield. Yet even here, some chose risk, hiding the sick, warning of selections, offering brief comfort before separation. These acts did not stop death, but they preserved humanity. As the war situation worsened for Germany, executions increased. Panic replaced order. The SS accelerated killing to prevent prisoners from being liberated. Lists grew longer. Transport trains departed more frequently. Gunfire echoed more often. Plaso was no longer merely supporting extermination elsewhere. It had become an extermination site in its own right. The camp's function was clear: extract what labor was possible, then discard the rest. Lives were measured in usefulness, not humanity. When usefulness ended, death followed. By this stage, prisoners understood a brutal truth: survival had little to do with behavior or effort. It depended on timing, chance, and visibility. The system was not fair. It was not rational. It was designed to destroy unpredictably, to prevent adaptation. And yet, even as executions multiplied, the camp did not descend into chaos. It remained structured. Orders were followed. Guards reported for duty. Paperwork was filed. Terror was routine. This was the most chilling aspect of Plaso: how ordinary the extraordinary cruelty became. In the next chapter, we move beyond daily terror and into the wider machinery: how Plaso fed labor into the Nazi war economy, how its subcamps spread across the region, and how industrial needs prolonged suffering even as Germany moved toward defeat. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Nazi War Economy. By the time Plaso entered its fifth phase of existence, its purpose had fully crystallized. Terror was no longer only about punishment or control. It was about production. The camp had become a critical node in the Nazi war economy, a place where human suffering was converted directly into military output, construction materials, and logistical support for a Reich fighting an increasingly desperate war. Forced labor was the backbone of Plaso. Every prisoner's life was measured against their ability to work. Strength meant temporary survival. Weakness meant removal. From the moment prisoners arrived, their bodies were evaluated not as human beings, but as units of labor, replaceable, expendable, and ultimately disposable. The earliest labor assignments centered on construction. Prisoners were forced to build the camp itself. Barracks, fences, watchtowers, roads, and storage facilities. They worked with primitive tools, minimal clothing, and almost no food. Frostbitten hands lifted stones. Starving men dragged beams. Those who collapsed were beaten or killed. The camp grew because prisoners built it, even as it destroyed them. As the war intensified, Plaso's labor focus expanded beyond construction. Prisoners were assigned to stone quarries, brickworks, metal workshops, and repair facilities. Others were sent to nearby factories that produced equipment for the German military. Ammunition components, uniforms, vehicle parts, and infrastructure materials flowed outward from the camp, each item carrying the invisible cost of exhaustion, injury, and death. Workdays began before dawn and ended after nightfall. Prisoners were marched to labor sites under armed guard, often several kilometers away. Anyone who could not keep pace risked being shot or beaten. At the work sites, productivity was enforced through violence. Guards monitored output closely. Falling behind quotas resulted in punishment, flogging, reduced rations, or execution. Food rations were deliberately insufficient for the labor demanded. Thin soup, a scrap of bread, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger was not a failure of logistics. It was policy. Starvation weakened prisoners, shortened their lives, and ensured constant turnover. The system relied on a steady supply of new bodies to replace those worked to death. The contradiction was intentional. Prisoners were expected to perform heavy labor while being denied the calories required to survive it. This imbalance accelerated death while extracting maximum output in the short term. It was exploitation designed for efficiency, not longevity. Skilled prisoners were especially valuable. Engineers, machinists, electricians, and craftsmen were identified and assigned to specialized tasks. Some received marginally better conditions, slightly more food, less brutal assignments, but this privilege came with constant fear. One mistake, one accusation, one inspection could end their protection instantly. Many skilled prisoners lived with a quiet terror, knowing that their usefulness kept them alive, and knowing that usefulness could disappear at any moment. Unskilled laborers fared far worse. They were sent to the heaviest, most dangerous tasks: hauling stone, digging trenches, clearing debris, carrying loads far beyond human limits. Injuries were common. Medical care was minimal. Broken bones, crushed limbs, infected wounds were often untreated. An injured prisoner was no longer useful. Selection followed quickly. Women prisoners were also forced into labor, often under conditions equally brutal. They worked in sorting facilities, workshops, and later in factories producing goods for the Reich. Sexual abuse, harassment, and violence were constant threats. Pregnancy was treated as a crime. Mothers were separated from children. Labor erased identity, gender, and family alike. Children, when present, were rarely assigned meaningful work. Their presence itself was considered a problem. Many were selected early. Those who survived often did so by hiding, by being concealed by adults, or by sheer chance. Childhood had no place in the camp economy. The SS viewed labor as both punishment and profit. Contracts were signed with German companies. Payments were made for prisoner labor. Human beings were leased as tools. Death did not cancel contracts, it was factored into them. Losses were expected and replaced. This commodification of life marked a turning point. Plaso was no longer just an extension of ideological hatred. It was an economic instrument. Killing and profit were intertwined. Bureaucracy sanitized brutality. Invoices replaced names. Ledgers replaced lives. Prisoners became acutely aware of this reality. They spoke of being used up, of bodies failing before quotas, of watching others disappear when they could no longer work. Survival depended on maintaining the illusion of strength, standing straighter at roll call, hiding injuries, suppressing coughs, masking pain. Small acts of resistance emerged even within forced labor. Sabotage occurred quietly. A misaligned part, a weakened joint, a tool dropped at the wrong moment. These acts were dangerous. Discovery meant execution, but they offered prisoners a sense of agency, however fragile, in a system designed to strip it away. Some prisoners used labor assignments to help others, stealing scraps of material to barter for food, sharing knowledge, passing warnings about inspections or selections. These networks were fragile and constantly threatened, but they existed. Solidarity survived even under crushing pressure. As Germany's military situation worsened, demands on labor intensified. More output, fewer resources, longer hours. The camp responded by extracting more from fewer survivors. Death rates climbed. Exhaustion became universal. The line between work and execution blurred completely. Plaso's role in the war economy prolonged suffering. As long as labor was needed, prisoners were kept alive just long enough to produce. When production declined, they were removed. The system adjusted without pause. This was the grim arithmetic of forced labor. Output over humanity, efficiency over life, silence over conscience. In the next segment, we will follow this labor system beyond the camp itself, tracing how Plaso expanded into a network of subcamps, how prisoners were scattered across factories and work sites, and how the geography of terror spread outward as the Reich struggled to sustain its war. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Subcamps and the Expansion of Terror. As Plaso became more deeply embedded in the Nazi war economy, its reach extended far beyond the barbed wire that enclosed the main camp. What had begun as a single site of confinement and terror gradually transformed into the center of a sprawling network of forced labor subcamps. A decentralized system designed to extract as much labor as possible from prisoners while dispersing suffering across an ever-widening landscape. This expansion was not accidental. It was strategic. German industry demanded workers. Transportation shortages made it inefficient to move materials long distances. The solution was simple and ruthless. Move the prisoners instead. From Plaso, prisoners were dispatched to dozens of satellite camps scattered across Kraków, southern Poland, and occupied territories beyond. Some subcamps were attached to factories, others to quarries, construction sites, rail yards, armament workshops, or infrastructure projects. Each subcamp was smaller than Plaso, but no less lethal. Conditions in the subcamps were often worse than in the main camp. Prisoners were housed in makeshift barracks, abandoned buildings, barns, or converted warehouses. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Medical care was minimal or entirely absent. Guards were fewer, but violence was more arbitrary, more personal, and often unchecked. Food rations were even smaller than those in Plaso. Labor demands were relentless. Prisoners worked 12 to 14 hours a day, sometimes longer, under constant threat of punishment. Injuries were common. Death was routine. Replacement was expected. Being sent to a subcamp was a gamble. Some offered marginally better survival odds due to less overcrowding or slightly improved food access through black market exchanges. Others were virtual death sentences, known among prisoners as places from which no one returned. Information traveled quickly through whispered warnings and coded conversations. Prisoners learned the names of subcamps to fear. Assignment lists at roll call caused visible panic. Selection for transfer could provoke breakdowns, desperate pleas, or attempts to hide. Once transferred, prisoners were often cut off entirely from the outside world. Subcamps operated with little oversight. Records were poorly kept. Deaths went unreported. Executions were carried out without documentation. People vanished without trace. The SS viewed subcamps as efficient tools. They reduced overcrowding in Plaso while maximizing output elsewhere. They also fragmented prisoner communities, weakening resistance and solidarity. Isolation increased vulnerability. Control became easier. Yet even within this fragmentation, prisoners adapted. New hierarchies formed. Informal leaders emerged. Skills were traded for protection. Food was shared when possible. Networks reassembled under new conditions, fragile but persistent. Some subcamps were tied directly to German companies. Prisoners produced weapons parts, repaired vehicles, assembled machinery, or worked on military construction projects. The relationship between the SS and industry was transactional. Companies paid for labor. The SS provided bodies. Death was not a concern. Replacements could always be requested. This arrangement blurred the line between state terror and private profit. Industrial managers visited work sites. They inspected output. They complained about productivity. Rarely did they question why workers collapsed or disappeared. Responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. For prisoners, the distinction between SS guard and civilian supervisor meant little. Authority was absolute either way. Complaints were impossible. Resistance was dangerous. Survival depended on obedience and endurance. Women were frequently assigned to subcamps attached to factories. They worked in textile production, electronics, sorting, and assembly. Sexual violence, exploitation, and humiliation were common. Pregnancy was punished. Mothers were separated from children. Gender offered no protection. Children in subcamps were especially vulnerable. Many were too weak to work. Some were hidden by adults or assigned trivial tasks to keep them alive. Most did not survive long. The system had no use for them. As the war dragged on and Allied bombing intensified, demand for dispersed production increased. Subcamps multiplied. Prisoners were moved repeatedly, weakening them further. Each transfer meant new conditions, new dangers, new uncertainty. Winter worsened everything. Cold killed silently. Inadequate clothing, frozen barracks, and exposure during long work shifts drained remaining strength. Illness spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, diseases that thrived where bodies were already breaking. Punishment in subcamps was swift and severe. Beatings for missed quotas. Public executions for alleged sabotage. Collective punishment for individual acts. Fear was a constant presence, shaping every decision. Despite this, acts of resistance continued. Some prisoners sabotaged machinery. Others stole materials to trade for food. Information was passed when possible. Warnings were shared. Survival itself became an act of defiance. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, the pressure on subcamps intensified. Production targets rose even as resources dwindled. Prisoners were pushed harder. Death rates soared. Guards became more brutal, sensing collapse but clinging to authority. The expansion of the subcamp system transformed Plaso from a single site of terror into the administrative heart of a regional killing machine. Suffering radiated outward, touching villages, factories, forests, and rail lines. The geography of cruelty expanded with the Reich's desperation. By the time this network reached its peak, Plaso was no longer just a camp. It was a command center coordinating labor, transfers, punishment, and death across a vast area. The system functioned not through chaos, but through grim organization. In the next segment, we will examine how the sprawling structure intersected with leadership, corruption, and absolute power, focusing on the camp authorities who enforced the system, the privileges they abused, and the terror they wielded with near-total impunity. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Authority Without Limits, Power, Corruption, and Daily Terror. As Plaso expanded into a vast system of forced labor and satellite camps, one truth became unavoidable. Absolute power had settled into the hands of the camp authorities. In this environment, rules existed only when they served control. Punishment was not corrective. It was expressive, a language through which domination was communicated daily. At the center of this system stood the SS command structure, headed by the camp commandant and enforced by guards, block leaders, capos, and administrative staff. Together, they formed a hierarchy where cruelty was not an accident, but an expectation. Advancement depended not on restraint, but on efficiency and loyalty to terror. The commandant ruled Plaso like a private domain. His authority was nearly total. Oversight was minimal. Complaints from prisoners were meaningless. Reports to higher SS offices focused on productivity, discipline, and output, not survival. As long as labor quotas were met and order maintained, methods were irrelevant. Daily life for prisoners was shaped by unpredictability. Violence did not follow consistent rules. It followed mood, impulse, and opportunity. A glance interpreted as disrespect. A step out of line. A moment of weakness. Any of these could provoke a beating or execution. Roll calls were moments of dread. Prisoners stood for hours, regardless of weather, while guards counted and recounted bodies. Those who collapsed were beaten or dragged away. Corpses were sometimes left standing as warnings. Accuracy mattered less than demonstration. Public punishment was deliberate theater. Whippings were conducted before assembled prisoners. Hangings took place in visible areas. The message was clear: fear was collective. Guilt was irrelevant. Obedience was survival. Capos, prisoners appointed to supervise other prisoners, occupied a dangerous middle ground. Some abused their authority brutally, using violence to secure privileges. Others tried quietly to protect those under them. But the system ensured that even the most compassionate capo was trapped. Failure to enforce discipline invited punishment or replacement. This structure fractured solidarity. Prisoners were forced into roles that pitted survival against morality. Cooperation with the system could mean food, shelter, or time. Resistance often meant death. The Nazis understood this dynamic well. They weaponized desperation.
Corruption flourished.
Guards stole valuables confiscated from prisoners. Food was diverted. Clothing was sold or traded. Bribes passed hands. Favors exchanged for protection or assignment to less deadly labor. The camp became an economy built on stolen lives. The black market extended beyond the fences. Local civilians benefited indirectly from forced labor and stolen goods. Businesses profited from contracts. Farmers received workers. Responsibility diffused outward, blending terror into normalcy. Women prisoners faced unique forms of abuse. Sexual violence was widespread, though rarely documented. Pregnancies were punished. Forced abortions occurred. Mothers were separated from children. Gender did not shield, it compounded vulnerability. Children were viewed as useless mouths. Many were killed outright or left to starve. Those who survived did so through extraordinary effort. Hidden, protected, or assigned meaningless tasks to keep them alive. Their existence was constantly threatened. Medical abuse was another instrument of power. Camp doctors conducted experiments without consent. Treatments were withheld. Injections were lethal. Selection for medical care often meant death. Medicine became another weapon. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis thrived in overcrowded barracks. The SS did not attempt meaningful prevention. Illness reduced productivity, but replacement was easy. Death required no justification. Executions occurred without trial. Prisoners accused of sabotage, escape attempts, or resistance were shot, hanged, or beaten to death. Often accusations were fabricated. Proof was unnecessary. Authority alone decided. Psychological terror was constant. Prisoners never knew what tomorrow would bring. Transfers, punishments, selections, death. This uncertainty eroded resistance more effectively than walls or weapons. Hope itself became dangerous. Yet even here, humanity persisted. Prisoners whispered warnings, shared food, taught one another skills, memorized names. These acts were small, fragile, and risky, but they mattered. Survival was collective, even when enforced isolation tried to destroy it. The camp authorities underestimated this resilience. They believed terror alone could erase identity. Instead, it forced identity underground, quieter but not gone. As the war turned against Germany, conditions worsened. Supplies dwindled. Food rations shrank. Violence increased. Guards grew more brutal, more erratic. Fear of accountability began to surface, expressed through harsher discipline and destruction of records. Plaso entered a new phase, one defined not just by exploitation, but by impending collapse. Evacuations were discussed. Evidence needed to disappear. Prisoners became liabilities rather than assets. The same authority that once enforced order now struggled to maintain control. Chaos crept in, but it did not bring relief. It brought desperation, executions, and mass death. This was the final transformation of power in Plaso, from structured terror to uncontrolled brutality. In the next chapter, we will follow the camp into its final phase: the dismantling of Plaso, the forced evacuations, the death marches, and the attempt to erase what had happened there, even as the system itself began to crumble. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The beginning of the end. Dismantling a camp of terror. By the middle of 1944, the world beyond the barbed wire of Plaso was changing, and the SS knew it. The German war effort was collapsing on multiple fronts. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east. Allied bombers dominated the skies. Rumors filtered into the camp through guards, civilian workers, and newly arrived prisoners. Germany was losing. And with that realization came a dangerous shift inside Plaso. The camp was no longer just a place of exploitation. It was becoming a problem to be erased. Plaso had never been intended to exist forever. Like many camps, it was a temporary solution in a system that constantly adapted to circumstance. But now, its very existence threatened those who had built and run it. Tens of thousands of witnesses remained alive. Mass graves lay beneath the soil. Administrative records detailed deportations, executions, and labor quotas. If the front reached Krakow, Plaso would become evidence. The SS response was not to stop the killing, but to reorganize it. Orders began arriving from higher authorities. Camps closer to the advancing front were to be reduced, evacuated, or liquidated. Prisoners deemed unfit were to be removed first. Those who could still work would be transferred deeper into the Reich. The objective was clear: preserve labor, destroy witnesses. Inside Plaso, prisoners sensed the shift almost immediately. Roll calls became more frequent and more chaotic. Barracks were emptied and refilled without explanation. Lists were read aloud, names called, then ordered to step forward. No one knew whether selection meant transfer, execution, or survival. The uncertainty was suffocating. Executions increased. Prisoners accused of resistance, sabotage, or even minor infractions were killed without ceremony. The SS no longer cared about appearances. Discipline became raw violence, driven by fear and impatience. Guards understood that time was running out, and some acted with increasing cruelty, others with barely concealed panic. Mass graves were disturbed. Prisoners were forced to exhume bodies buried months or years earlier. Corpses were burned on open pyres. Ashes were scattered. This work was carried out under strict secrecy, guarded heavily, and accompanied by executions to ensure silence. The goal was not sanitation. It was concealment. Administrative offices worked around the clock. Records were destroyed. Files were burned. Inventories vanished. The bureaucracy that had once carefully documented suffering now tried desperately to erase it. Paper, once the backbone of genocide, became a liability. At the same time, transports began leaving Plaso. Thousands of prisoners were marched out under SS guard, sent to camps such as Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and camps deeper inside Germany. These transfers were brutal. Prisoners were given little food, no explanation, and no guarantee of arrival. Those who collapsed along the way were shot or left to die. For many, evacuation meant death, not later but immediately. Those who remained in Plaso faced worsening conditions. Food rations collapsed further. Medical care disappeared entirely. Disease spread unchecked. Barracks grew more overcrowded as prisoners from smaller subcamps were pushed back into the main camp. The SS no longer invested in maintaining order, only control. Children were among the most vulnerable. With evacuations underway, they were often deemed useless. Some were killed outright. Others were deported, separated from parents without explanation. Mothers were forced to choose between staying with children or following labor transports that offered a slim chance of survival. Either choice carried unbearable consequences. The labor system itself began to fracture. Factories lost materials. Production targets became meaningless. Prisoners were still forced to work, but the rhythm was broken. Days of frantic activity followed by sudden stoppages. The war economy that once depended on Plaso was disintegrating. Inside the camp, resistance networks sensed opportunity but also danger. The collapse of authority did not mean safety. It meant unpredictability. Any attempt at organized revolt would be crushed instantly. Survival now depended on timing, concealment, and luck. Some prisoners attempted escape during evacuations. A few succeeded, slipping into forests or blending into civilian populations. Most were hunted down. The SS intensified patrols, executing captured escapees publicly to deter others. The command structure itself began to change. Officers were reassigned or fled. New personnel arrived, less experienced, more volatile. Discipline among guards weakened. Alcohol abuse increased. Violence became less ordered, more impulsive. Power was unraveling. Yet even as Plaso moved toward dissolution, the system refused to end humanely. The final phase was not a release, it was a purge. A frantic attempt to remove traces of crime while extracting the last possible value from human lives. For prisoners, this was the most terrifying period of all. Not because hope was gone, but because it flickered unpredictably. Liberation seemed possible. Death felt imminent. Every day carried both. The dismantling of Plaso did not happen in a single moment. It was a process, deliberate, chaotic, and deadly. A camp built on terror could not simply close its gates. It had to destroy itself first. In the next segment, we will follow the evacuations in detail, the death marches, the final transports, and the brutal journeys that carried Plaso's prisoners into the last, desperate chapter of the Nazi camp system. Chapter 6, Segment 2, The Evacuations, Death Marches out of Plaso. As the dismantling of Plaso accelerated, evacuation became the final instrument of terror. What the SS called transfers were, in reality, death marches, carefully organized movements designed to extract labor, eliminate witnesses, and allow thousands to perish along the way. By late 1944 and early 1945, Plaso was no longer a fixed destination. It was a departure point into uncertainty, exhaustion, and mass death. The orders were simple. Prisoners who could still walk would be marched west. Those who could not would be dealt with inside the camp. Evacuations often began before dawn. Prisoners were woken abruptly, sometimes beaten from sleep, ordered to assemble with no explanation. They were allowed to carry little or nothing, no food reserves, no spare clothing. Shoes were often inadequate, torn, or missing entirely. Winter cold cut through threadbare uniforms. The SS guards, wrapped in coats and armed, moved among the columns with dogs and rifles. Roll calls stretched for hours. Names were checked against lists that shifted constantly. Confusion was deliberate. Prisoners were separated from friends, relatives, and family members in seconds. A glance, a whispered word, was often the last contact before separation became permanent. When the columns finally moved, the pace was brutal. Marches covered dozens of kilometers a day, regardless of weather or physical condition. Prisoners stumbled through snow, mud, and frozen roads. Hunger was constant. Water was scarce. Guards forbade stopping except at designated points, and even then, rest was minimal. Anyone who fell behind was beaten. Anyone who collapsed was shot. Bodies were left along roadsides, in ditches, in fields, as warnings to those still walking. Civilians along the routes sometimes witnessed these columns. skeletal figures guarded by armed men, moving silently except for coughing, crying, and the sound of boots. Some civilians looked away. Others tried to offer food or water and were threatened or arrested. Fear controlled everyone. For prisoners, the marches were not simply physical ordeals. They were psychological torture. Every step carried uncertainty. No one knew the destination. Some hoped for labor camps with better conditions. Others feared extermination. Many suspected they were being marched to death. At night, prisoners were crammed into barns, factories, or open fields. No medical care was provided. Those who died overnight were dragged away at dawn. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread rapidly in these conditions. Weak prisoners were often killed deliberately to prevent slowing the column. The SS guards themselves were under pressure. Supplies were short. Command structures were breaking down. Some guards became more brutal, lashing out in frustration and fear. Others abandoned columns entirely, fleeing as Allied forces approached. This inconsistency made the marches even more dangerous. Discipline collapsed, but violence did not. From Plaso, prisoners were sent to camps such as Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and smaller subcamps scattered across Germany and occupied territories. Many transports arrived only to find camps already overwhelmed, food non-existent, barracks overflowing. Survival rates plummeted. Those deemed too weak to march often faced immediate execution at Plaso itself. Prisoners reported selections carried out hastily, without medical pretense. Sick, injured, elderly, and children were separated and killed. Gunshots echoed across the camp grounds. Mass graves grew larger. Some prisoners were forced onto trains instead of marches. These transports were no safer. Boxcars were sealed, overcrowded, unheated, and unsanitary. Journeys lasted days or weeks. Prisoners died standing up, crushed by bodies, suffocated, frozen. When trains arrived, guards opened doors to remove corpses before unloading survivors. Escape during evacuation was rare, but some tried. A few slipped into forests, hid in villages, or collapsed intentionally in hopes of being overlooked. Most escapees were hunted down. Captured prisoners were tortured or executed publicly to reinforce fear. Within Plaso, each evacuation reduced the population, but conditions worsened for those left behind. Food rations were cut further. Barracks were stripped of supplies. SS guards stole belongings openly. Administrative order disintegrated, replaced by chaos and cruelty. Families were destroyed in this phase. Parents lost children. Spouses were separated. Siblings vanished in different directions. Many survivors would later say the evacuations were the moment hope finally broke. Not because survival was impossible, but because the system ensured that survival came alone. The evacuations were not accidental byproducts of war. They were policy, a calculated decision to let exhaustion, exposure, and starvation finish what the camp had begun. By the time Plaso was nearly emptied, thousands of prisoners had vanished along roads, in forests, in fields, and in unmarked graves stretching across Central Europe. Their deaths were never recorded, their names never written down. The camp itself grew quieter, not because suffering ended, but because it was exported elsewhere. In the next segment, we will turn to the final days inside Plaso itself, the last executions, the SS retreat, and the moment when terror finally lost control, leaving behind silence, survivors, and evidence that could no longer be erased. Chapter 6, Segment 3. The Last Days. Executions, Erasure, and Silence. As Plaso emptied through evacuations and transports, the camp entered its final phase, a period defined not by order, but by frantic violence and deliberate erasure. What remained was not a functioning labor camp, but a collapsing crime scene. The SS understood that the war was being lost. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, Allied armies from the west. And Plaso, with its mass graves, execution sites, and thousands of witnesses, had become a liability. The response was not mercy. It was acceleration. In the final weeks, executions increased sharply. Prisoners still inside the camp described a constant sense of impending death, not knowing whether the next roll call would end with transfer or a bullet. Guards no longer followed consistent procedures. Lists were incomplete. Orders changed daily. Some executions were planned. Others were spontaneous. The most vulnerable were targeted first. Sick prisoners in the infirmary were removed and shot. Those unable to work were no longer useful and therefore disposable. Children who had survived earlier selections were killed quietly, often away from the main camp to avoid unrest. Older prisoners, political detainees, and known members of resistance networks were singled out and executed to eliminate leadership and testimony. Gunshots echoed from known killing sites, the quarry, nearby forests, isolated hillsides. Prisoners learned to recognize the sound patterns. Single shots for individuals, bursts for groups. Bodies were buried in mass graves or burned in pits. In some cases, prisoners were forced to exhume earlier graves and destroy remains, a final act of humiliation imposed on the living to erase the dead. The SS worked systematically to destroy evidence. Documents were burned. Records were shredded. Camp offices were stripped of files. Personal effects taken from murdered prisoners, shoes, clothing, photographs, jewelry, were looted or destroyed. Graves were leveled where possible. Witnesses were removed through evacuation or execution. Even the camp infrastructure was altered. Barracks were dismantled or abandoned. Equipment was transported west. Supply depots were emptied. What could not be moved was destroyed. Plaso was being erased while it still existed. Inside the camp, discipline among guards fractured. Some SS personnel fled early, deserting posts. Others became increasingly violent, driven by fear, alcohol, and rage. Prisoners described guards shooting at random, beating inmates for minor infractions, or killing simply to assert control in a system collapsing around them. Yet even in this chaos, prisoners continued to resist in small, quiet ways. Some hid the sick to prevent their selection. Others shared scraps of food to keep someone alive one more day. Resistance networks, weakened by evacuations, still tried to preserve names, memories, and testimonies, burying notes, whispering information, memorizing details so that if even one person survived, the truth would not disappear. Survival had become an act of defiance. As the front drew closer, the SS accelerated final evacuations. Those still capable of walking were forced out. Those left behind, too weak, too ill, too young, faced imminent death. Prisoners described nights filled with fear, expecting executions at dawn. Many slept fully clothed, prepared to run, hide, or die. Food distribution nearly ceased. Water was contaminated. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus and dysentery claimed lives daily. Bodies remained uncollected for hours or days. The smell of death permeated every corner of the camp. Plaso was no longer producing labor. It was consuming lives. Then, abruptly, the guards began to vanish. SS units withdrew in stages, abandoning posts without explanation. Some guards discarded uniforms. Others fled toward Germany. The structure of terror dissolved almost overnight. Prisoners watched as watchtowers emptied, gates were left unguarded, and silence replaced shouting. But liberation did not come immediately. For days, prisoners remained trapped, afraid to leave, unsure whether the SS would return, uncertain what awaited beyond the camp. Some prisoners ventured outside and were shot by retreating units or local collaborators. Others collapsed from exhaustion the moment fear loosened its grip. When Soviet forces eventually reached the area, they did not find a functioning camp. They found what remained after systematic destruction. Plaso was nearly empty. Survivors were skeletal, sick, traumatized. Mass graves scarred the land. Execution sites were visible even after attempts at concealment. The ground itself bore witness: disturbed soil, ash, bone fragments. Unlike extermination camps with intact gas chambers, Plaso appeared deceptively incomplete. This partial destruction contributed to its later invisibility in public memory. But for those who survived, the evidence was undeniable. After liberation, survivors faced a new struggle. Medical care was scarce. Typhus outbreaks threatened both prisoners and liberators. Many died after liberation, bodies unable to recover after years of starvation. Others wandered in search of family members who would never return. Few records existed to confirm deaths. Entire families had vanished without documentation. Justice would come slowly. Plaso's crimes were later investigated through survivor testimony, forensic evidence, and captured documents. Commanders and guards were tried. Some were executed. Others escaped accountability. The scale of suffering was undeniable. Yet incomplete records meant countless victims remained unnamed. Memory itself became fragile. The campsite was gradually overtaken by development. Buildings were dismantled. Graves went unmarked. Unlike Auschwitz, Plaso lacked monumental preservation for decades. Silence threatened to finish what violence had begun. But survivors spoke. Historians reconstructed. Witnesses testified. And the truth endured. Plaso's final days reveal the true nature of the Nazi camp system. Not only its cruelty, but its intent to erase itself once exposed. The violence did not end with evacuation. It intensified, and even as the regime collapsed, it continued killing to the very last moment. In the next chapter, we will examine what came after liberation, testimony, trials, and the long, difficult fight to ensure that Plaso would not vanish from history, even if the Nazis tried to make it disappear forever. Chapter 7, Segment 1. After liberation, survival, silence, and the struggle to live. Liberation did not arrive at Plaso as a single, triumphant moment. There was no dramatic opening of gates, no clear handover from terror to safety. Instead, liberation came as absence, the sudden disappearance of guards, the silence of abandoned watchtowers, and the slow realization among prisoners that the system that had controlled every breath of their lives had finally collapsed. For many, freedom began with confusion. Prisoners emerged cautiously from barracks that had become cages, unsure whether the SS would return, unsure whether stepping beyond the perimeter meant safety or death. Some had lived through false retreats before, moments when guards temporarily withdrew only to return with violence. Trusting silence was dangerous. Fear had become instinct. Those who did venture outside encountered a devastated landscape. The campgrounds were littered with evidence the SS had failed to erase. Shallow graves, burned pits, scattered belongings, blood-soaked earth. The smell of decay hung in the air. Bodies lay where they had fallen during the final days, unburied, unnamed. Survival itself was fragile. Years of starvation had reduced prisoners to skeletal forms. Organs were weakened, immune systems destroyed. Even after the threat of execution vanished, death continued quietly. Many collapsed from exhaustion once the pressure to survive eased. Others died from infections, typhus, or heart failure, bodies unable to recover from prolonged abuse. Medical care was minimal and overwhelmed. Soviet and later Polish authorities faced a humanitarian crisis. Survivors required food, shelter, clothing, and treatment, but refeeding had to be done cautiously. Many who ate too much, too quickly, suffered fatal complications. Doctors learned through tragedy that survival required restraint as much as relief. For the survivors, the psychological toll was immediate and profound. Some were unable to speak. Others spoke compulsively, desperate to be heard before memory faded or disbelief took hold. Many experienced disorientation, the sudden absence of orders, numbers, punishments. Simple choices like where to sleep or when to eat became overwhelming. Freedom felt unreal. And outside the camp, the world was often unrecognizable. Krakow had changed. Neighborhoods were emptied. Jewish homes were occupied by strangers. Synagogues were destroyed or repurposed. Families were gone. Survivors searching for relatives moved through lists, hospitals, refugee centers, and ruins, often discovering that they were the last of their families. For many, there was nothing to return to. This realization defined the post-liberation experience. Survival had been the goal for years. Now survival raised new questions. Where do you go when home no longer exists? Who are you when everyone who knew you is dead? Some survivors stayed near Plaso temporarily, too weak or traumatized to move. Others joined displaced persons camps, beginning long journeys westward or toward Palestine. Some attempted to rebuild lives in Poland, only to face continued anti-Semitism, hostility, and violence. Liberation did not end persecution. It changed its form. At the same time, another process began: documentation. Investigators, journalists, and military officials began collecting testimony. Survivors were asked to describe what had happened. Executions, forced labor, the actions of guards, names of commanders. For many, reliving these memories was agonizing. But silence felt worse. They spoke because they understood something crucial. If they did not speak, Plaso would disappear. Unlike Auschwitz, Plaso had no gas chambers standing as visible symbols of genocide. Its crimes were written into the land itself, into soil disturbed by graves, into memories carried by the living. Without testimony, denial would find fertile ground. Survivors provided names, dates, descriptions, patterns. They described Amon Göth's reign of terror. They identified execution sites. They explained how labor, punishment, and murder were intertwined. They told investigators how children were killed, how families were destroyed, how survival depended on chance as much as endurance. These testimonies became the foundation for justice. Trials followed. Some perpetrators were captured and prosecuted. Göth himself was tried by Polish authorities, convicted, and executed in 1946. His crimes were proven through survivor testimony and physical evidence, one of the rare instances where a camp commandant faced accountability. But justice was incomplete. Many SS personnel escaped punishment. Some reintegrated into post-war society. Records had been destroyed. Witnesses were dead. Time worked against truth. As years passed, memory faced a new threat: neglect. Plaso was not preserved as a formal memorial in the immediate post-war years. The site was gradually absorbed by urban development. Buildings rose where barracks once stood. Graves went unmarked. For decades, the camp existed more in memory than in landscape. This absence mattered. Without physical reminders, public awareness faded. Plaso became a footnote, overshadowed by camps designed solely for extermination. Yet for those who survived, it remained the center of their lives, the place where time had stopped and suffering had been normalized. Survivors fought against forgetting. They returned to the site. They spoke to historians. They recorded testimonies. They challenged attempts to erase or sanitize what had occurred. Each story became an act of resistance against oblivion. Because survival alone was not enough. Memory had to survive too. In the next segment, we will examine how Plaso was slowly rediscovered, how historians, survivors, and memorial movements worked to reclaim the site, mark the graves, and confront a painful truth: that some of the most brutal crimes of the Holocaust occurred in places that almost vanished from history entirely. Chapter 7, Segment 2, Erasing a Camp. How Plaso almost vanished from history. When the war ended, Plaso did not become a symbol. It became a problem. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, Plaso was not preserved as a frozen crime scene. There were no intact gas chambers, no museum gates, no immediate international attention. The Nazis had dismantled much of the camp before retreating, and what remained was scattered, ambiguous, and uncomfortable. A landscape soaked in violence but lacking obvious structures that demanded remembrance. And so, slowly, Plaso began to disappear. In the immediate post-war years, Poland was focused on rebuilding a shattered nation. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and political control shifted rapidly under Soviet influence. In this environment, Plaso was not prioritized as a memorial site. It was seen as damaged land on the outskirts of Krakow, scarred, yes, but usable. Barracks were dismantled, fences removed, watchtowers collapsed or were torn down. The ground itself was never neutralized. Mass graves remained beneath the soil. Execution sites were left unmarked. Ash pits were covered over by grass and weeds. What had once been a tightly controlled universe of terror became an open, undefined space. Urban development followed. Apartment blocks, roads, and industrial buildings gradually encroached on the former campgrounds. Children played where prisoners had been executed. Families walked dogs across land that concealed unmarked graves. For many residents, the full history of the area was unknown or quietly avoided. This transformation was not accidental. It was convenient. Plaso posed difficult questions. It forced confrontation with collaboration, with local knowledge of atrocities, with the reality that genocide did not occur only in distant, sealed-off camps, but in places woven into everyday life. Forgetting was easier than facing these truths. For survivors, this erasure was devastating. They returned years later and found nothing recognizable. No verdics, no signs, no names. The place where they had lost families, identities, and years of their lives had been absorbed into normality, as if the suffering had never happened. Survivors spoke of a second loss. The loss of memory. Some attempted to locate specific sites, where executions took place, where children were killed, where forced labor zones once stood. But without markers, without records, the landscape resisted identification. Memory clashed with development. At the same time, Holocaust denial and minimization began to emerge globally. The absence of physical evidence at Plaso made it vulnerable to distortion. Without visible structures, skeptics questioned scale. Without preserved ruins, stories were dismissed as exaggeration. Silence created space for doubt. This is when survivors understood something deeply unsettling. Survival was not the final battle. Memory was. In the 1960s and 1970s, survivors, historians, and Jewish organizations began pushing for recognition. They gathered testimonies, maps, photographs, and Nazi documents. They reconstructed the camp through words when stone no longer remained. Historians traced the boundaries, identified execution zones, mapped burial pits. Each detail mattered. Each coordinate reclaimed space from forgetting. Yet progress was slow. Political sensitivities, limited funding, and bureaucratic resistance delayed formal commemoration. Plaso did not fit neatly into existing memorial narratives. It was neither a ghetto nor an extermination camp in the strictest sense, but something in between. A hybrid of terror that defied easy categorization. And that ambiguity worked against it. The release of Schindler's List in 1993 brought global attention back to Plaso. But even then, the focus often centered on Amon Göth as an individual villain rather than on the systemic machinery of the camp itself. The danger was personalization, reducing mass terror to one man's cruelty, rather than confronting the structure that enabled him. Survivors resisted this framing. They emphasized that Göth was not an aberration, he was a product, a functionary operating within a system designed to reward brutality. Removing him from the narrative risked absolving the system itself. Gradually, memorial efforts gained traction. Markers were placed. Mass graves were acknowledged. Educational initiatives began documenting Plaso's history more fully. But even today, the site remains fragmented. There is no single, enclosed memorial space. No clear entrance. No definitive path guiding visitors through the history. Instead, memory is scattered, just as the camp itself once was. Visitors must seek knowledge actively. Understanding requires effort. This, too, is part of Plaso's legacy. It reminds us that genocide does not always leave monuments. Sometimes it leaves silence, and silence must be challenged deliberately. Because forgetting does not happen all at once. It happens step by step, just like persecution once did. In the next segment, we will examine how Plaso is remembered today, how educators, survivors, descendants, and historians continue to fight for recognition, and why this camp, nearly erased, remains essential to understanding how Nazi terror functioned beyond gas chambers and headlines. Chapter 7. Segment 3. Memory Against Silence. Why Plaso Still Matters. Plaso was almost erased. But what remains is not just land. What remains is responsibility. In the decades after the war, the absence of walls and barbed wire created an illusion that Plaso was less real, less permanent, less central to the machinery of Nazi terror. Yet this absence is precisely what makes the camp so important to understand. Plaso reveals a truth that preserved ruins cannot always show. That genocide does not require monumental architecture to function, and memory does not depend on intact buildings to survive. What defined Plaso was not what stood there, but what happened there. Plaso was a camp without gas chambers, yet tens of thousands died. It was a place where murder occurred in daylight, without secrecy, without industrial disguise. Executions were public. Beatings were routine. Starvation was deliberate. Terror was visible, normalized, and embedded into daily procedure. Guards did not hide their actions. They performed them. This challenges one of the most dangerous misconceptions about the Holocaust, that it was hidden. In Plaso, it was not. The camp sat on a hill overlooking Kraków. Gunshots echoed across the valley. Smoke rose from burning bodies. Civilians lived nearby. Railway lines passed through. Workers, officials, and contractors interacted with the camp system regularly. Plaso existed within society, not outside it. And this is why remembering Plaso is uncomfortable. It forces the question not only of perpetrators, but of proximity, of awareness, of silence. For survivors, memory became an act of defiance. Many spoke despite trauma, despite disbelief, despite the pain of reliving moments that language could barely contain. They described the randomness of executions, the constant fear, the way time dissolved into survival hours. They remembered names, faces, routines, because those details anchored reality in a place designed to strip it away. Survivor testimony became the camp's architecture. Without barracks to preserve, words became walls. Without fences, memory became boundary. Without watchtowers, testimony became warning. Historians began to understand that Plaso was not an anomaly, but a model of a specific phase of Nazi control, a transitional space between ghettos and extermination camps, a site where forced labor, terror, and mass murder overlapped fluidly, a place where death did not arrive in a single moment, but accumulated over time. This matters because Plaso represents how genocide adapts. It shows that extermination does not always rely on factories of death. It can be achieved through starvation, exposure, punishment, and exhaustion, methods that leave fewer ruins but equal devastation. It shows how bureaucracy can kill without spectacle, and how cruelty can be administered as routine. The camp also reveals how easily perpetrators can disappear into history. Many SS guards melted back into civilian life. Some were prosecuted, many were not. The system that empowered them collapsed, but accountability remained uneven. Justice arrived late, partially, and imperfectly, if at all. This uneven reckoning reinforces another lesson of Plaso. That time does not automatically deliver justice. Memory must demand it. Today, Plaso exists as an open landscape, a place without gates, where remembrance depends on awareness. Visitors can walk across former execution grounds without realizing it. This reality is unsettling, but it is also instructive. It reminds us that history does not always announce itself. Evil does not always leave ruins. Sometimes it leaves ordinary ground. And it is precisely here that education becomes vital. Teaching Plaso means teaching how systems functioned, how orders flowed, how fear was enforced, how power was performed through randomness and humiliation. It means teaching that the Holocaust was not only about camps of mass gassing, but about camps of sustained terror, about places where survival itself was weaponized against the prisoner. It also means teaching that remembrance is fragile. Without active effort, silence expands. Without testimony, distortion grows. Without acknowledgement, denial finds space. Plaso almost vanished once. Cannot be allowed to vanish again. Because what happened there did not begin with Amon Göth. And it did not end with his execution. It was part of a system built by people. A system maintained by obedience, a system that thrived on indifference. And that is why Plaso still matters. Not because it is unique, but because it is representative. Not because it is preserved, but because it nearly was not. Not because it ended, but because its lessons are unfinished. In the final chapters of this documentary, we will follow Plaso beyond liberation, into justice, memory, and the ongoing struggle to tell its story fully. Because understanding Plaso is not only about honoring the dead. It is about recognizing how easily a place of terror can fade, and how urgently it must be remembered. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The collapse begins. War turns against the camp. By late 1944, the war that had carried Plaso into existence was beginning to turn against its creators. The German front lines were collapsing on every axis, and the illusion of permanence that had surrounded the Nazi camp system began to fracture. Yet inside Plaso, there was no sense of relief, no signal that suffering was nearing its end. Instead, the camp entered one of its most dangerous phases, the moment when a system built on control began to unravel, and terror became more unpredictable than ever before. The collapse did not arrive suddenly. Crept in through shortages, confusion, and shifting orders. Supply lines weakened. Trains arrived irregularly. Guards grew more anxious, more violent, more erratic. Discipline hardened not because the SS felt powerful, but because they felt exposed. When a system based on absolute authority senses its own vulnerability, it often lashes out. And Plaso was no exception. By this stage of the war, Plaso was no longer just a labor camp serving the Kraków region. It had become a holding point within a collapsing network. Prisoners were moved in and out with increasing frequency, sometimes staying only days or weeks before being transferred again. Lists were rewritten constantly. Names were crossed out. Entire barracks were emptied overnight. For prisoners, this created a new kind of terror. The terror of uncertainty layered on top of starvation, exhaustion, and fear. Rumors spread through the camp like smoke. Some whispered that the Germans were losing. Others spoke of advancing Soviet forces. Still others warned that the SS would kill the prisoners before allowing liberation. No rumor could be confirmed, and hope itself became dangerous, because disappointment carried its own psychological weight. As the front drew closer, the camp's purpose began to shift. Labor still mattered, but containment mattered more. The SS no longer focused on productivity alone. They focused on erasing evidence. Documents were destroyed or removed. Records were altered. Mass graves were concealed. Executions increased, often justified as punishment for alleged infractions that no longer needed explanation. Order remained, but it was brittle, enforced through fear rather than confidence. For prisoners, daily life became even more unstable. Roll calls stretched longer. Food rations shrank further. Medical neglect intensified. Those too weak to stand were selected more aggressively, not always for immediate death, but for transport to unknown destinations. Every movement became a threat. One of the most frightening aspects of this phase was randomness. Earlier in the camp's existence, terror had been systematic. Brutality followed routines. Punishments were predictable in their cruelty. Now, violence became arbitrary. A guard's mood could mean survival or death. A misplaced glance, a delayed step, an accidental stumble could result in execution. Control was no longer precise, it was reactive. This randomness shattered what little psychological stability prisoners had built. Survival strategies that once worked, staying unnoticed, following patterns, conserving energy, began to fail. The system was no longer consistent enough to navigate safely. Meanwhile, transports from other camps increased. As Nazi authorities evacuated camps closer to the front, prisoners were pushed westward into camps like Plaso. These new arrivals brought stories of death marches, mass shootings, camps burned and abandoned. Their condition alone told a story. Emaciated bodies, frostbite, untreated wounds, eyes hollowed by prolonged terror. Plaso absorbed them without preparation. Barracks already overcrowded were packed further. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and respiratory infections flourished in conditions that no longer even pretended to meet basic survival needs. The camp became not just a place of forced labor and execution, but a breeding ground for slow, unstoppable death. The SS response was not medical, it was administrative. The sick were isolated not to heal, but to remove them from sight. The dying were ignored. The dead were disposed of quickly, often without record. Life expectancy dropped sharply, even among prisoners who had previously managed to survive. At the same time, the authority structure inside the camp began to fracture. Some guards deserted. Others drank heavily. Orders contradicted one another. Prisoner functionaries were given impossible tasks, enforcing discipline without resources, maintaining order amid chaos. This placed them in an impossible moral position, torn between survival and complicity. Resistance networks inside the camp sensed the change. Where earlier resistance focused on survival, sharing food, hiding the sick, preserving dignity, it now began to shift toward information and preservation. Prisoners memorized names, dates, routines. They whispered details meant to survive them. They understood that even if they did not survive, the truth must. Yet open rebellion was impossible. The camp remained heavily armed. Violence remained absolute. Any organized uprising would have meant immediate annihilation. Resistance remained quiet, internal, and fragile. As the months passed, it became clear that Plaso would not be liberated intact. The SS began preparing evacuations. Trains were scheduled. Routes were planned. Prisoners were sorted again, not by skill, but by perceived usefulness and expendability. Those selected for transport did not know whether they were being moved for labor, execution, or erasure. This uncertainty was deliberate, prevented resistance, prevented solidarity, kept prisoners focused on the next hour, not the larger picture. By the time evacuation orders began in earnest, Plaso was no longer functioning as a stable camp. It was a system in retreat, still lethal, still cruel, but increasingly desperate. The war had turned. But inside Plaso, the cost of that turning was paid by those who had already lost everything. In the next segment, we will follow what happened when the SS finally began to dismantle Plaso, when prisoners were forced onto transports and marches that carried terror beyond the camp gates, and when the final phase of suffering began under the guise of movement and relocation. Because for many prisoners, the end of Plaso did not mean freedom. It meant something even more dangerous. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Evacuation Without Mercy. When movement became a death sentence. When the decision was made to evacuate Plaso, it was not driven by concern for prisoners or even by logistical necessity alone. It was driven by fear of accountability, fear of witnesses, fear that the evidence of what had been done would fall into enemy hands. The evacuation was not an ending designed to preserve life. It was an extension of the camp's logic, carried beyond its fences. For the prisoners, movement did not mean rescue. It meant exposure, exhaustion, and death without walls. Orders came abruptly and without explanation. Entire blocks were assembled before dawn. Names were read from lists that changed by the hour. Some prisoners were selected for transport. Others were left behind, unsure whether they had been spared or simply delayed. No one was told where they were going. Auschwitz, Mauthausen,
Großrosen.
or nowhere at all. In Plaso, ignorance was a weapon, and it remained one until the final days. The evacuations unfolded in stages, creating waves of terror rather than a single release. Trains arrived without warning, sometimes after days of waiting in the cold. Prisoners were marched from the camp to loading points under armed guard, forced to carry what little they owned. A bowl, a blanket, scraps of clothing that barely held together. Those who stumbled were beaten. Those who collapsed were shot. The road out of Plaso quickly became another killing ground. For many, the transport itself was fatal. Rail cars were packed far beyond capacity. There was no food, little air, and no sanitation. People stood pressed together for hours or days, unable to sit, unable to move. The sick were crushed by the living. The dead remained upright, held in place by the bodies around them. When the doors finally opened, survivors emerged into new camps already half dead, carrying disease, shock, and trauma that no medical system could address. Others were not sent by train. They were marched. The so-called evacuation marches, later known as death marches, were carried out in winter conditions with deliberate cruelty. Prisoners were driven across frozen roads with inadequate clothing and almost no food. Guards set a pace that only the strongest could maintain, and even they struggled. Anyone who fell behind was beaten or executed on the roadside. Villages were passed in silence, civilians watching from windows, sometimes unable to look, sometimes pretending not to see. For prisoners, the march erased any remaining structure of camp life. There were no barracks, no roll calls, no routines, only relentless movement. Night brought no rest, only freezing ground and fear. Morning brought renewed violence. Time dissolved. Survival became a matter of steps, one more, then another, until even that calculation failed. Not all evacuations were completed. As the front lines closed in faster than expected, the SS lost control of schedules. Some transports never reached their destinations. Some guards abandoned their posts. Others doubled down, killing prisoners rather than risk capture with witnesses. Orders conflicted, authority fractured, and in that fracture, death accelerated. Inside Plaso itself, those left behind faced a different kind of danger. As prisoners were removed, the camp was stripped down. Barracks were emptied. Equipment was dismantled or destroyed. Mass graves were concealed. Documents were burned. The SS attempted to erase the camp not just physically, but administratively, to make it disappear from history as if it had never existed. Executions increased sharply during this phase. With fewer prisoners and less oversight, guards acted with unchecked brutality. Small groups were taken out under pretexts that no longer mattered. Shots echoed through the grounds with no attempt at concealment. The message was clear. The end was near, and mercy would not arrive with it. For those still alive, hope became dangerous again. Some prisoners believed that being left behind meant imminent liberation. Others feared it meant extermination. Both possibilities existed simultaneously, and neither offered comfort. Liberation could arrive with bullets just as easily as with freedom. The unpredictability of the final days created a psychological torment unlike anything that had come before. Yet even here, fragments of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared information when they could. They warned one another of selections. They hid the sick when possible. They memorized names, faces, and details, understanding that survival was not the only form of resistance. Memory itself mattered. Truth mattered. As the evacuations continued, Plaso ceased to function as a camp in any conventional sense. It became a corridor, a place people passed through on their way to death elsewhere, or a place emptied so rapidly that time itself seemed to collapse. The SS no longer managed a system. They reacted to its disintegration. By early 1945, the camp stood partially abandoned, haunted by those who had been moved and those who had not survived the attempt. The machinery of terror was still present, but it was sputtering, operating on inertia rather than design. The evacuation of Plaso did not bring closure. It spread the suffering outward, into roads, railways, forests, and villages, ensuring that the camp's violence did not end at its gates. What had been concentrated within barbed wire now followed prisoners across the collapsing Reich. In the next segment, we will witness what happened when the camp finally fell silent, when the SS withdrew, when the surviving prisoners faced the aftermath of abandonment, and when the reality of Plaso began its long transformation from living terror into historical evidence. Because the end of the camp was not the end of its consequences. It was the beginning of reckoning. Chapter 8, Segment 3, The Camp Without Masters. Abandonment, survival, and the moment before liberation. When the last organized evacuations left Plaso, the camp did not immediately become empty. It became something far more unsettling. A place without clear authority, without order, and without certainty. The SS had not vanished all at once. They thinned out unevenly, leaving behind fragments of control, confused guards, and prisoners who no longer knew whether they were about to be freed or murdered where they stood. In this liminal space between occupation and collapse, survival became more precarious than ever. The routines that had governed daily life disintegrated. Roll calls were irregular or abandoned entirely. Work details stopped being assigned with any consistency. Barracks stood half-empty, filled with the belongings of those who had been marched or transported away. Bowls, shoes, scraps of paper, names carved into wood. The camp felt paused in mid-breath, as if waiting for something terrible or miraculous to happen next. For prisoners still inside Plaso, this uncertainty was agonizing. Some believed liberation was imminent. They listened for distant artillery, watching the horizon for signs of advancing forces. Others feared that the absence of structure meant only one thing, that the SS would return to finish the job once they decided what to do. Both interpretations were supported by experience. In the Nazi camp system, moments of transition were often the most lethal. The remaining guards were unpredictable. Some abandoned their posts quietly, slipping away into civilian clothing or attempting to disappear into the countryside. Others stayed, clinging to authority even as it lost meaning. These guards were often more dangerous than before, stripped of oversight, driven by fear, and unsure whether obedience or brutality would best secure their own survival. Violence became arbitrary. Punishments were inflicted without procedure. Executions occurred without explanation. The camp was no longer a machine. It was a wound left open. Inside the barracks, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies were nearly gone. Distribution, when it happened at all, was chaotic. Prisoners scavenged from abandoned kitchens, stole from storage rooms, or searched the grounds for anything edible. Many were too weak to move. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia flourished in overcrowded, filthy spaces where water systems barely functioned. Medical care had effectively ceased. Those who had survived years of forced labor now faced death from neglect. Bodies lay where they fell, sometimes left for days because no one had the strength to move them. Survivors slept beside the dead, not out of indifference, but exhaustion. The boundary between living and dying blurred until it became impossible to tell who would still be breathing by morning. And yet, something else emerged in this absence of control. Mutual aid. Prisoners who could still move began organizing quietly. They checked on one another. They shared food when possible. They tried to clean wounds, to isolate the sick, to maintain fragments of order not imposed by terror but created by necessity. These were not acts of optimism. They were acts of defiance, refusals to let the camp dictate the terms of their final days. Information became vital. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the Soviets were close. Others claimed American forces were advancing. No one knew which army would arrive or when. Every sound carried weight. Every distant explosion was analyzed, debated, hoped over, feared. Time slowed into an unbearable crawl. For many prisoners, liberation had become an abstract concept. After years of confinement, brutality, and loss, freedom was difficult to imagine. Some feared it would not come in time. Others feared they would not survive it, that bodies starved and weakened beyond repair would collapse once the pressure of survival was lifted. These fears were not unfounded. Many who lived to see the end of the camp would die shortly afterward, their systems unable to recover. Meanwhile, the SS continued their efforts to erase evidence. Even as their control collapsed, attempts were made to destroy documents, dismantle installations, and conceal mass graves. The logic of denial persisted until the final moment. What could not be removed was abandoned. What could not be hidden was left behind in the hope that no one would arrive in time to see it. When liberation finally came, it did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with shock. The soldiers who entered the remnants of Plaso encountered a scene that defied comprehension. Skeletal survivors, abandoned barracks, bodies unburied, silence where thousands had once been imprisoned. The camp no longer resembled an operational facility. It resembled the aftermath of a catastrophe frozen in place. For the survivors, liberation was disorienting. There was relief, yes, but also confusion, fear, and grief. Some did not trust it. Others were too weak to react. Many asked the same question again and again: what now? Families were gone. Homes were destroyed. Countries had changed. Survival had come at the cost of everything familiar. Plaso did not end cleanly. It dissolved. Its violence seeped into the evacuations, into the roads, into the camps that followed, and into the lives of those who survived. The absence of order in its final days did not bring peace. It revealed how thoroughly terror had stripped away normality, how even freedom required relearning how to exist. In the next chapter, we will confront the aftermath, how Plaso was documented, remembered, distorted, and fought over in memory, how survivors testified, how perpetrators were judged or escaped justice, and how a place designed to disappear was forced back into history. Because the final crime of Plaso was not only what happened there, it was the attempt to make it vanish. Chapter 9, Segment 1. After the barbed wire, evidence, testimony, and the struggle to name the crime. When Plaso ceased to function as a camp, it did not immediately become history. It became a problem, a crime scene without walls, a landscape saturated with violence, and a question the world was not yet prepared to answer. Liberation did not close the chapter. It opened a long, uneven struggle to understand what Plaso had been, what had happened there, and how responsibility would be assigned in the aftermath of unprecedented destruction. In the first days after liberation, survival came before justice. Thousands of former prisoners were sick, malnourished, and traumatized. Medical teams focused on preventing epidemics, stabilizing those on the brink of death, and providing basic care to people who had been deprived of it for years. Many survivors could barely speak. Others spoke constantly, urgently, afraid that if they stopped talking, their stories would disappear with them. The campgrounds were chaotic, filled with abandoned structures, scattered belongings, shallow graves, and evidence that had not been fully erased. Plaso did not resemble the image of a single, clearly defined camp. It was spread across hills, quarries, execution sites, and work areas that blended into the surrounding city. Mass graves were hidden under rubble, roads, and vegetation. Some were known to survivors. Others were discovered only later. The land itself had absorbed the violence, making documentation slow and incomplete. Investigators faced an immediate challenge: how to document a crime that had been designed to leave as little trace as possible. Records had been destroyed or removed. Administrative files were missing or deliberately falsified. Many perpetrators had fled, been reassigned, or blended into civilian populations. The camp commandant, Amon Göth, was no longer present. He had been arrested months earlier by the SS itself for corruption, not for mass murder, but for stealing Jewish property and misusing authority. His absence complicated the early narrative, creating confusion about responsibility and command. Survivor testimony became the foundation of truth. Men and women who had endured Plaso were asked to describe what had happened, often repeatedly, often while still weak and ill. They spoke of executions, forced labor, starvation, random killings, and the constant terror imposed by guards. They described Göth's daily shootings from his villa balcony, the role of female guards, the use of dogs, and the systematic humiliation that defined life in the camp. These testimonies were not always consistent in detail. Trauma rarely produces neat timelines, but they were consistent in essence. Plaso was a place of deliberate cruelty. As post-war trials began to take shape, the challenge was not whether crimes had occurred, but how to categorize them. The legal frameworks available at the time were insufficient. The scale of violence exceeded existing definitions of war crimes. Genocide as a legal concept was still being formulated. Prosecutors struggled to translate lived horror into language that courts could recognize and punish. Amon Göth eventually became one of the most prominent figures associated with Plaso's crimes. After the war, he was extradited to Poland and put on trial in Krakow. Survivors testified against him in overwhelming numbers. They described his arbitrary executions, his sadism, his complete disregard for human life. The court heard accounts of children being shot, prisoners being killed for sport, and punishment carried out without cause. Göth showed little remorse. He attempted to minimize his actions, framing them as obedience to orders or exaggerations by witnesses. The court rejected these defenses. Göth was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1946, near the site of the former camp. His trial became one of the earliest and clearest legal acknowledgments of the atrocities committed at Plaso. Yet even this conviction did not bring closure. Göth was only one man. Plaso had been sustained by an entire system: guards, administrators, suppliers, engineers, local collaborators, and bureaucrats who enabled its operation. Many of these individuals were never prosecuted. Some reintegrated into post-war society quietly. Others disappeared into displaced populations. Justice was uneven, incomplete, and often shaped by political priorities rather than moral clarity. For survivors, the end of the camp did not mean the end of suffering. Many returned to Krakow or attempted to reclaim homes that no longer existed or were occupied by others. Families had been annihilated. Communities were gone. Anti-Semitism did not disappear with the defeat of Nazi Germany. In some cases, survivors faced hostility, disbelief, or indifference. Their memories were inconvenient reminders of a past many wanted to forget. Plaso itself faded quickly from public consciousness. Unlike Auschwitz, it did not become an immediate symbol of the Holocaust. There were no large gas chambers preserved, no iconic entrance gate, no clear boundaries. The land was gradually redeveloped. Housing projects were built. Roads were laid. Everyday life resumed on top of buried graves. For decades, the camp existed more vividly in survivor memory than in public history. This absence was not accidental. Plaso challenged simplified narratives. It was not an extermination camp in the strictest sense, nor was it merely a labor camp. It occupied a gray zone, a place where mass murder, forced labor, and arbitrary terror coexisted. Its crimes were harder to categorize, harder to visualize, and therefore easier to overlook. Survivors fought against this erasure. They recorded testimonies, wrote memoirs, spoke to historians, and returned to the site when possible. They pointed out execution grounds, burial sites, and structures that no longer bore names. Their insistence forced Plaso back into historical consciousness, slowly and unevenly. Memorial efforts faced resistance, funding shortages, and political debates about how or whether the site should be marked. The struggle over memory became another battlefield. Who would define what Plaso had been? How would it be taught? Would it be reduced to a footnote or recognized as a central part of the Holocaust in occupied Poland? These questions remained unresolved for decades, shaped by shifting governments, cultural attitudes, and the passage of time. In the next segment, we will examine how Plaso has been remembered, misrepresented, and reclaimed through memorials, scholarship, film, and the voices of those who refuse to let the camp disappear. Because the final stage of violence is silence. And remembering Plaso means refusing that silence. Chapter 9. Segment 2. Buried Ground, Contested Memory. How Plaso was forgotten, distorted, and rediscovered. In the years that followed the war, Plaso entered a strange and troubling second existence, not as a place of terror, but as a place slowly erased. Unlike camps that were preserved behind fences and gates, Plaso dissolved into the everyday life of Krakow. Its barracks were dismantled. Its watchtowers vanished. Roads cut through execution sites. Apartment buildings rose where prisoners once stood in roll call. The ground absorbed the past, and the city moved forward, often without looking down. This disappearance was not only physical. It was political, cultural, and psychological. Post-war Poland was rebuilding from devastation, navigating shifting borders, population transfers, and a new communist government. In this landscape, Jewish suffering, especially suffering that did not fit neatly into heroic resistance narratives, was frequently marginalized. Camps like Auschwitz, which symbolized industrial genocide on an enormous scale, became central to Holocaust memory. Plaso, fragmented and less visually legible, slipped into the margins. The camp's very structure made remembrance difficult. Plaso had not been enclosed by a single, iconic perimeter. It spread across multiple hills, quarries, workshops, and execution zones. Some areas overlapped with existing neighborhoods even before the war. Others were absorbed into urban expansion afterward. There was no single gate through which visitors could be led. No preserved Baroque rows to walk between. The crime scene was dispersed, and so was responsibility. For survivors, this erasure was deeply painful. Many returned to Krakow years later and struggled to locate the places where they had nearly died. Familiar landmarks were gone. Graves were unmarked. Silence replaced testimony. Survivors spoke of standing on hillsides where mass shootings had occurred, watching children play, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. The contrast between past and present was almost unbearable. Yet for decades, their voices were often unheard. Early memorial efforts were limited, understated, or symbolic rather than informative. Small plaques appeared, offering vague language about victims of fascism, without specifying who the victims were, who the perpetrators were, or what had happened there. This ambiguity reflected broader trends in post-war memory, where specificity was sometimes seen as divisive or politically inconvenient. Plaso became a place without a clear story. This ambiguity allowed distortions to take root. Over time, the camp was mischaracterized in public understanding, sometimes portrayed as less severe, sometimes reduced to a backdrop for other narratives. The absence of visible remains made it easier for denial, minimization, and confusion to spread. When a place looks ordinary, it becomes harder to imagine extraordinary violence. The turning point came slowly, driven by scholarship and survivor persistence rather than official initiatives. Historians began piecing together Plaszo's history through scattered documents, testimonies, aerial photographs, and post-war trial records. Archaeological surveys identified burial sites and structural remnants beneath the soil. Survivor organizations pushed for recognition, demanding that the camp be acknowledged not just as a labor site, but as a place of systematic murder. One of the most powerful and controversial forces shaping public memory of Plaso was FILM. The release of Schindler's List in 1993 brought global attention to the camp, introducing millions to the name Plaso for the first time. The film's portrayal of Amon Göth and the camp's brutality left a deep impression on audiences. For many, it became their primary reference point for understanding Plaso. But this visibility came at a cost. Cinematic storytelling, by necessity, simplifies. It centers certain figures and compresses timelines. While the film captured real horrors, it also risked narrowing public understanding, focusing on Göth as a singular monster rather than on the broader system that enabled him. Some survivors welcomed the attention. Others worried that fiction would replace history, that the complexity of the camp would be overshadowed by a single narrative. This tension revealed a deeper question. Who owns memory? Is it shaped by survivors, historians, governments, artists, or audiences? Plaso, the answer was never clear. Each group approached the site with different needs: commemoration, education, closure, or symbolism. These competing visions sometimes clashed, delaying meaningful preservation and interpretation. Only in recent decades has Plaso begun to receive more comprehensive recognition. Plans for a formal memorial and educational center emerged, aimed at presenting the camp's full history with accuracy and dignity. Scholars emphasized the importance of naming victims and perpetrators, marking execution sites, and contextualizing the camp within the broader system of Nazi occupation and genocide. The goal was not to reconstruct the camp physically, but to reconstruct understanding. Even now, the struggle continues. Urban development pressures remain. Funding debates persist. Public awareness varies widely. Some visitors arrive expecting dramatic ruins and leave confused by the openness of the landscape. Others feel overwhelmed by the realization that genocide occurred not behind distant fences, but in spaces that now resemble parks and neighborhoods. This discomfort is part of Plaszo's legacy. The camp forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Mass violence does not always leave obvious scars, can be absorbed into normality, can be paved over. It can survive only in memory, unless that memory is actively preserved. Plaso teaches us that forgetting is not passive. It is a process shaped by choices: what to mark, what to teach, what to name, and what to leave unsaid. The camp's long absence from public consciousness was not inevitable. It was the result of silence, distraction, and discomfort. In the next segment, we turn to the present, to the ongoing efforts to reclaim Plaso as a site of conscience, and to the question that still hangs over the hills of Krakow. How do we honor the dead when the world they died in no longer exists? Because memory, like justice, does not end. It must be rebuilt again and again. Chapter 9, Segment 3, A Landscape that Testifies. Plaso today and the responsibility of remembrance. Today, Plaso does not confront visitors with gates, guard towers, or preserved barracks. There is no single entrance announcing that this ground was once a place of terror. Instead, the former camp exists as an open landscape. Rolling hills, patches of grass, scattered trees, walking paths, and fragments of stone. At first glance, it appears quiet, almost ordinary. And it is precisely this ordinariness that makes Plaso so unsettling. The absence is the evidence. Where prisoners once stood for hours during roll call, the wind now moves freely. Where execution pits swallowed thousands, the soil lies level, giving no immediate sign of what it holds. Where SS officers once observed forced labor, people now walk dogs or pause to look out over the city. Plaso forces visitors to imagine rather than observe, to reconstruct horror not through preserved structures, but through knowledge. This makes remembrance more difficult and more necessary. Unlike camps that remain visually intact, Plaso demands active engagement. Without historical context, it is easy to misunderstand the site, to mistake it for a park, a wasteland, or a forgotten corner of the city. This ambiguity has long been one of Plaso's greatest challenges. Memory here is fragile, dependent on education, interpretation, and intention. In recent years, efforts to confront this challenge have intensified. Historians, educators, and memorial institutions have worked to map the camp's original layout, identifying mass graves, execution sites, labor zones, and administrative areas. Modern signage and markers now attempt to orient visitors, connecting present-day geography with past events. These markers do not overwhelm the landscape. They speak quietly, mirroring the camp's current silence while restoring meaning to the ground. One of the most profound aspects of Plaso today is the confrontation it creates between past and present. Standing on the site, visitors are forced to reckon with how genocide can disappear into everyday life. Apartment buildings overlook former killing grounds. Roads cross paths once walked by starving prisoners. The city of Krakow continues to grow, not in denial, but in uneasy proximity to buried history. This coexistence raises difficult questions. Can a place of mass death ever be fully integrated into normal life? Should it be? And who decides how much of the past is allowed to remain visible? There are no simple answers. Some argue that preserving ruins risks freezing trauma in place, preventing healing. Others believe that without physical reminders, memory fades too easily. Plaso exists somewhere between these positions, neither reconstructed nor erased, neither fully memorialized nor forgotten. Its form reflects the moral complexity of remembrance itself. For survivors and their descendants, this complexity is deeply personal. Many have returned to Plaso seeking connection, not to structures, but to ground. They stand where they remember suffering, searching for points of orientation that no longer exist. For some, the openness is painful, a reminder of how easily the world moved on. For others, it is meaningful proof that life continued, even where death once dominated. What unites these perspectives is the understanding that memory must be protected. Plaso's story does not live in stone alone. It lives in testimony, in archives, in education, and in the choices made by those who inherit the site. Without continued effort, the camp risks becoming abstract, a name without substance, a tragedy reduced to a footnote. This is why Plaso matters beyond its history. It challenges the assumption that remembrance is automatic. It shows that even crimes of immense scale can fade if they are not actively preserved. And it warns us that the mechanisms of violence, bureaucracy, dehumanization, obedience, do not require dramatic settings to function. They can operate quietly in places that later look harmless. Standing at Plaso today, one realizes that genocide does not always announce itself. And neither does forgetting. The responsibility now lies with those who walk this ground, study its history, and tell its story. To name what happened, to resist simplification, to refuse silence. Memory here is not imposed by walls or fences. It must be chosen. Plaso offers no spectacle. It offers a question. What will you remember when nothing forces you to remember at all? In the final chapter, we move beyond the landscape itself, to the legacy of Plaso within Holocaust history, and to the lesson it leaves behind for a world that continues to struggle with hatred, power, and human cruelty. Because the true end of a camp is not liberation.it is whether its warning is heard. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Legacy of Plaso, When Terror Leaves No Walls. Plaso did not end with liberation, because Plaso was never fully contained by fences alone. When the SS abandoned the camp in early 1945, they left behind more than mass graves and ruined infrastructure. They left behind a legacy that resisted simple closure. Unlike camps that became symbols through preserved ruins, Plaso entered history as something far more difficult to confront. A crime scene that dissolved into the everyday world, a place where terror left few physical remains but countless moral questions. Its legacy is not defined by what stands but by what vanished, and by how easily it could have vanished completely. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Plaso received little attention compared to Auschwitz or Treblinka. There were no gas chambers to shock the world, no intact barracks to photograph, no dramatic liberation footage to circulate widely. Much of the camp had already been dismantled by the SS, and what remained was quickly absorbed by a city struggling to survive its own post-war devastation. In this silence, Plaso risked becoming invisible, not because its crimes were lesser, but because their evidence was quieter. Yet, for survivors, there was no disappearance. The trauma of Plaso followed them into displaced persons camps, into emigration, into rebuilt lives shadowed by memory. Many struggled to explain what Plaso had been because it did not fit simple categories. It was not a ghetto, not a death camp in the industrial sense, not merely a labor camp. It was all of these at once, and that complexity made it harder to communicate harder to memorialize, and easier for the world to overlook. This is where Plaszow's historical importance deepens. The camp exposes a critical truth about the Holocaust. Genocide did not require a single method. It adapted. It blended labor with terror, bureaucracy with violence, and routine with murder. Plaso shows how mass death could occur without gas chambers. Through shootings, starvation, disease, exhaustion, and arbitrary brutality. It reveals how cruelty could be normalized through repetition, how terror could be enforced by unpredictability, and how dehumanization could be sustained without constant spectacle. In this way, Plaso represents a bridge between systems. It connects the ghettos to the camps, the Einsatzgruppen to the extermination centers, the ideology of hatred to its everyday enforcement. The camp structure reflected the Nazi belief that some lives could be exploited until they ceased to be useful, and then erased without ceremony. This logic did not end in 1945. It survives wherever people are reduced to categories, numbers, or threats rather than recognized as human beings. The post-war trials addressed some of the crimes committed at Plaso, but justice was incomplete. Amon Göth's execution became a symbol, yet it risked oversimplifying responsibility, focusing outrage on one individual while obscuring the system that enabled him. Thousands of guards, administrators, clerks, and collaborators passed through Plaso's machinery. Most returned to ordinary lives. The system that allowed them to function was rarely examined with the same intensity as its most visible monster. This imbalance shapes how Plaso is remembered. It challenges the idea that evil always announces itself through extraordinary figures. Instead, it shows how institutions, incentives, and silence can produce outcomes just as lethal. Plaso was not chaos. It was organized, scheduled, administered, and that is precisely why it remains relevant. Today, educators increasingly turn to Plaso to explain how genocide can occur without dramatic thresholds, how it can grow gradually under legal cover, enforced by routine rather than constant terror. The camp demonstrates how moral boundaries erode not all at once, but step by step, until violence becomes normal and resistance feels impossible. This is the legacy Plaso leaves behind. Not just a record of suffering, but a warning about systems that function too smoothly, authority that goes unquestioned, and language that disguises cruelty as necessity. Plaso reminds us that the most dangerous forms of violence are often those that appear orderly, justified, and efficient. As we move into the final segment, we confront the question that Plaso ultimately demands of every generation. What does it mean to remember a place that left so little behind, and what happens when memory itself becomes the last line of defense against repetition? Because Plaso was not meant to endure, and that is exactly why it must. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Memory Without Walls. How Plaso Nearly Disappeared. Plaso's most disturbing legacy is not only what happened there, but how close it came to being erased from history entirely. Unlike camps preserved behind gates and guard towers, Plaso dissolved back into the landscape almost immediately after the war. Grass grew over mass graves. Roads cut through former execution grounds. Apartment blocks rose where prisoners once collapsed from exhaustion. For decades, people lived, walked, and played on land that had absorbed unimaginable suffering, often without knowing, and sometimes without wanting to know. This near erasure was not accidental. It was the final success of a system designed to leave as little trace as possible. The Nazis dismantled Plaso with deliberate intent. Barracks were torn down, documents destroyed.
Graves cancelled.
Unlike extermination camps built for secrecy, Plaso was visible during its operation, but invisible afterward. When liberation came, there was no intact camp to preserve, no infrastructure easily converted into a memorial. What remained was terrain, scattered ruins, and survivor testimony. fragile things in a world eager to move forward. In the years immediately following the war, memory competed with survival. Poland lay devastated. Cities were rebuilding. Populations were displaced. Jewish survivors faced hostility, indifference, or pressure to remain silent. Many emigrated. Others buried their memories simply to endure daily life. In this environment, Plaso became a footnote, not because it mattered less, but because it lacked the physical permanence that demanded attention. And this absence created a dangerous illusion. Without walls, the camp seemed less real. Without barracks, its crimes felt abstract. Without constant reminders, denial and minimization found space to grow. Plaso became a case study in how history can fade not through falsification, but through neglect. The lack of spectacle made forgetting easier, and forgetting, in turn, became a second injustice. Yet memory survived where structure did not. Survivors spoke. Historians searched. Testimonies were recorded, sometimes decades after the events, by people who had lived with silence far longer than with words. Their accounts reconstructed Plaso not as a single location, but as an experience, a regime of fear, randomness, and control that could be carried inside the human mind long after physical liberation. This is where Plaso's significance deepens. It forces us to confront a central question of Holocaust memory. Is remembrance dependent on ruins, or can truth endure without visible evidence? Plaso shows that genocide does not require monuments to persist, but it does require witnesses to be believed. When physical traces vanish, responsibility shifts entirely to memory, education, and moral courage. In recent decades, efforts to reclaim Plaso's history have grown. Scholars mapped the camp using aerial photographs, testimonies, and forensic research. Memorial markers were placed. Educational initiatives began to explain not only what happened there, but why it mattered. Yet even today, the site remains contested between remembrance and ordinary life, between acknowledgement and discomfort. This tension reflects a broader challenge. Plaso exposes how societies struggle to integrate sites of mass violence into everyday landscapes. It is easier to relegate horror to distant, enclosed spaces than to accept that genocide unfolded in places now indistinguishable from normality. Plaso disrupts that comfort. It reminds us that atrocity does not always leave behind ruins. Sometimes it leaves behind neighborhoods. And that is why Plaso matters now more than ever. In a world where denial, distortion, and fatigue threaten historical truth, Plaso stands as a warning about what happens when memory lacks reinforcement. It shows how easily silence can replace acknowledgement, and how quickly the absence of visible proof can be exploited by those who wish to diminish the past. But memory, once reclaimed, has power. Every testimony recorded, every map drawn, every name restored pushes back against erasure. Plaso's history survives not because it was preserved, but because it was recovered piece by piece, voice by voice. That process itself is part of its legacy. As we move toward the final segment, we confront the ultimate question Plaso leaves behind. What responsibility does the present hold when the past leaves no walls? Only warnings? Because forgetting is not passive. It is a choice, and Plaso shows us what that choice can cost. Chapter 10, Segment 3. What Plaso leaves behind. Responsibility, warning, and the shadow that remains. Plaso does not end with liberation, trials, or memorials. It ends with a question that refuses to fade. What does a place like this demand from the future? Not sympathy, not shock, but responsibility. Because Plaso was not an accident of war or a breakdown of civilization, it was civilization functioning exactly as designed by a criminal ideology, enforced through laws, paperwork, obedience, and silence. This is the final lesson Plaso leaves behind. The camp did not exist on the fringes of society. It existed beside Krakow. It drew power from offices, courts, factories, railways, and neighborhoods. Its guards went home at night. Its commanders filed reports. Its victims were catalogued, transferred, reassigned, erased. Nothing about Plaso required chaos. It required participation. And that is why it remains dangerous to forget. When history is reduced to villains alone, responsibility feels distant. But Plaso exposes something more unsettling. How cruelty becomes routine when systems reward compliance and punish conscience. The camp functioned because thousands of small decisions aligned. Clerks stamping papers, soldiers following orders, civilians looking away, institutions prioritizing stability over morality. This is not a warning confined to the past. Plaso teaches that genocide does not begin with mass murder. It begins with classification, with language that divides, with laws that redefine who belongs and who does not, with violence framed as necessity, efficiency, or security. And once those steps are normalized, the final outcomes no longer feel shocking, they feel inevitable. The prisoners of Plaso understood this before the world did. They saw how quickly rights disappeared, how neighbors vanished, how work became punishment, how survival depended on invisibility, luck, or the mercy of individuals trapped inside an inhuman structure. They learned that resistance did not always mean rebellion. Sometimes it meant remembering your name, sharing a piece of bread, refusing to become what the system demanded. Those acts mattered. They mattered because they preserved humanity where the system sought to erase it. And they matter now because they define the moral boundary history asks us to defend. Plaso was built to strip people of identity. The act of remembering restores it. This is why testimony is sacred. Not because it recounts suffering, but because it interrupts denial. Each survivor account stands against the temptation to simplify, minimize, or relativize what happened. Each name recovered resists the Nazi goal of reducing human lives to numbers and ash. Memory becomes an act of justice when justice arrives too late for the dead. Yet remembrance alone is not enough. Plaso demands vigilance. It asks whether societies are willing to recognize early signs of dehumanization, before camps, before fences, before violence. It asks whether law is being used to protect dignity or to excuse cruelty. It asks whether obedience is being valued more than conscience. These questions are uncomfortable. That is precisely why they matter. Plaso also warns against selective memory, the kind that honors victims while ignoring causes. To say never again without understanding how it happened is to repeat the failure that allowed it in the first place. The Holocaust was not inevitable. Plaso was not inevitable. They were constructed step by step, decision by decision, which means they can be prevented, but only if remembered honestly. Today, the ground where Plaso stood is quiet.
No sirens.
No roll calls. No gunshots at dawn. But silence does not mean absence. The past does not vanish because it is buried. It waits in archives, in testimony, in the moral choices of each generation. Plaso's final message is not despair. It is accountability. Tells us that systems matter, that language matters, that indifference has consequences, and that memory, when actively carried forward, can interrupt the cycle that once led from bureaucracy to murder. This documentary does not ask you to witness suffering. It asks you to understand responsibility. Because Plaso was not only a place where people died. It was a place that shows how easily humanity can be dismantled and how urgently it must be defended. And that is why Plaso must never disappear again. Not from maps, not from history, not from conscience. The camp is gone. The warning remains. Plaso was never meant to leave traces. It was built to consume lives, erase names, and vanish without witnesses. Yet it did not succeed. What remains is not the camp itself, but the truth it tried to destroy, carried by survivors, preserved by history, and entrusted to memory. Plaso reminds us that terror does not arrive suddenly. It is constructed patiently, protected by obedience, and sustained by silence. This was not just a place of cruelty. It was a system, a warning. As the world grows quiet again, the responsibility to remember becomes heavier, because forgetting is what allows systems like this to return in new forms, under new names. Tonight, as this story comes to an end, let it not fade into darkness. Let it stay with you not as fear, but as awareness. Not as despair, but as resolve. Because remembrance is not passive. It is an act of resistance. Thank you for bearing witness. And thank you for remembering.